Good evening. Welcome to the September 8th, 2021 Community Formation Commission meeting. We'll call this meeting to order at 5:33. And Sam, if we could do roll call.
Sure. Commissioner Damo Milikan,
Present.
Commissioner Alonso, Commissioner Serafino Chavez,
Present.
Chair Escobedo,
Here.
Commissioner Kim Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Rachel Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Jordan Killebrew,
Here.
Commissioner Jacob Lesnar Buxton, absent. Commissioner Mario Gorman,
Here.
Commissioner Lizzie Rodriguez,
Here.
Commissioner Richard Sander,
Here.
Commissioner Louisa Wood,
Present.
and Vice Chair Zepeda.
Here.
And alternate Louis Reynaud. You have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to public comment on items that are not on today's agenda. Sam, do we have anyone in the public that would like to give public comment?
Give me 1 second, Chair. I see no one in attendance for public comment.
Okay, thank you. So we will move on to the administrative agenda, and that will be consideration and action on the draft Community Formation Commission meeting minutes for August 25th, 2021. Are there any changes that anyone on the commission would like to make to the meeting minutes? And if not, can we get a motion and a second to approve them?
Move to pass the minutes as submitted.
Second.
We have a first from Rich, a second from Jordan. Any discussion on the item? I'm not seeing any. So Sam, if we could do a voice vote.
Sure. There's a motion by Commissioner Sanders, seconded by Commissioner Killebrew to approve the minutes as presented. All in favor, say aye.
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 Against? Motion passes.
Thank you. So with that, we'll move on to the first item of tonight's meeting. And we're going to welcome on Chief Millikan, and I'm going to read it into the record. It's Santa Barbara Police Chief questions and answers. The Community Formation Commission will have the opportunity to ask the Santa Barbara Police Chief questions on policies, procedures, and other topics that are relevant to the development of civilian oversight. And just a housekeeping matter, we're going to limit this item to 1 hour. And if the commission would like in the future to bring back Chief Millikan for additional questions and answers, we can definitely make that happen. So without further ado, Chief Millikan, thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Chair Escobedo, members of the commission, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and talk with you tonight. I had some opening remarks, but I think I will cut most of them out to allow maximum time for questions and answers. But I thought I was trying to think about how to approach this talk tonight. And it occurs to me in some ways I've been in this business long enough that I'm almost like you've opened up a time capsule and you can follow the evolution of policing over the last nearly 50 years for better and for worse. And when I think back at where I started with the Santa Monica Police Department, and the emphasis at the time was on the professional model of policing, which was very much an arm's length, no community, no connection with the community. The idea was that you were going to rigidly enforce the law, and that was your mission. That was considered to be what the purpose of the police department was. And in some ways, what you're doing with this commission, and indeed what the final product will look like, is really to answer the question, what role do we want the police to play in society? And we'll come back to that in a second. I spent 23 years with the Santa Monica Police Department, and then I went to the Pasadena Police Department, where I was introduced in a far more dramatic fashion to the issues of race and policing in America. Pasadena is one of those cities that has, I think its image is that it's 2 square miles of mansions and once a year it has a parade. But the reality is that it is the 4th biggest city in Los Angeles County. It is a majority minority city. I was the first, at one time it was close to 40% African American. It's probably the home to the oldest African American community in Southern California. And I was the first non-African American police chief in about 13 years. And so the issues of race and policing were never very far from the surface. There were what I came to call a collision of narratives. There were people who remembered when they could not swim in the municipal pool or walk east of Fair Oaks Avenue after dark. And while that was never codified in any municipal code or written down in any resolution, it was a reality, and the police and the role of the police in enforcing that was part of the historical narrative. And so when you have this idea that a community that's 150 years old and it has one set of realities, and you send 23-year-old officers with the best of intentions into those same neighborhoods, you have these issues, and learning to deal with that and learning to understand the different narratives was a critical part of evolution, of my personal evolution, and I think of policing in general. I then went on to the COPS office in Washington and had the opportunity to travel to 32 different states and visit police and sheriff's departments throughout the country. And one of the things that I'm proudest of, and I think it is relevant to your work, is this notion of collaborative reform, which was brought forward in 2010, 2011, as a practical alternative to a formal legal consent. More about it if you wish, but it was introduced originally in Las Vegas, in Clark County, and ultimately in 13 other major cities around the country. I came to Santa Barbara in 2012. I had a consulting firm. My biggest client was the city of Seattle. I was involved with Nate Coley up in Seattle and helping develop oversight up there. And I've done audits in police departments around the country. And then since then, I've worked in the county, in both the sheriff's office and the county executive office. I'll close this sort of bio presentation with I did my doctoral dissertation on a concept of values-based discipline, which is the idea that if you want to change police culture, if you want to modify that behavior, then emphasis needs to be less legalistic and more on values and sort of doing the right thing. That 48-year time frame and where we are today, I think leaves this group with an interesting challenge, which is, one, what is the issue that we're trying to, or issues that we're trying to solve, both in terms of policing in general and specifically here in Santa Barbara. And secondly, and I think one of the advantages we have, and I think Cammie's talked about this at a couple of previous meetings, is that we are not, at least in Santa Barbara, you are not designing something in response to a local crisis. So you have the opportunity really to say, okay, what do we want oversight to look like today? And more importantly, how will that oversight help head off problems that have occurred in other jurisdictions and other places? And I think that question should be at the forefront. I have a lot of thoughts about what oversight looks like, but I suspect that you're going to ask me a lot about that anyway. And if you don't, I have notes and can continue talking. But I think I will stop for the moment and turn it over to the floor. And I again thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chief Millikan. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Does anyone have a question for Chief Millikan? Jordan?
Yeah, I'm curious as to Well, first and foremost, thank you for joining us and thank you for your time answering our questions. But I guess I'm curious to the current climate of the department at this current moment in time and in relation to this formation commission. So two-part question. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, I think that, and I think that's a good question. And I know that Lieutenant Hill has been working with some of you, and we've got to figure out a way to bring the commission, both the commissioners individually and the work of the commission, in front of the department, in front of the rank and file. I certainly won't sugarcoat the fact that the last year has been incredibly difficult for individual officers. We're not alone in facing challenges from people leaving, either leaving the profession altogether or at least leaving for departments maybe closer to where they live. And so as the numbers shrink, the issue of workload and capacity comes at the forefront. I think one of the reasons that the events of the last year have so impacted the men and women of the Santa Barbara Police Department is because the crisis, the national crisis that, and it didn't start last year, we all know that, it's been brewing, well, if you want to get technical, for a couple hundred years, but at least in terms of policing and how police should be reformed, I think the men and women of Santa Barbara are kind of taken aback by what they initially perceived, particularly last year, as a suggestion that the activities that may have been going on in other jurisdictions around the country were somehow that they were doing it as well, and they're kind of going, wait a minute, I'm not. And I think the discussion is, I've been particularly sort of impressed by the nature of the discussion over the last few weeks, is really about systems. And as I said in my opening remarks, about sort of heading off potential problems. I think the more that the commission can interact with the officers, it will accomplish two things. One, it will introduce the commission and its work to the officers. What I'm most concerned about, and I've talked to Lieutenant Hill about this at length, is when your final recommendations come forward after the first of the year, I really don't want to be in a place where officers feel like they're hearing it for the first time. And so I think the more we can increase that interaction, the better. I think equally important is that interaction with the police officers will help you realize that these are men and women just doing a job. I remember when you want to talk about the time capsule issues, 20-some years ago, I had the privilege of having breakfast with Eldridge Cleaver. And I hope nobody will raise their hand and say, who's that? I actually had that happen in a class one time. But Eldridge Cleaver had agreed to come and speak to the Pasadena Police Department. And I was having breakfast with him before his presentation, and I said, you've come a long way from the days when you hated the cops in Oakland. And he said, well, we didn't hate the cops. And I was a little taken aback by that. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, we hated the government. He said, it was just that the police were the only arm of government we ever saw. He said, and the reality is that 10% of the officers are sterling, outstanding human beings. And 10 of them, and I won't repeat the word that he used, 10% of them are the other end of the spectrum. And the other 80% are people just trying to do the best they can on a daily basis. And so if we can, and I mentioned collaborative reform, its essence was that the police department and the community sat down and said, one, what are the issues that we need to address? And two, what will the department commit to doing? And I think that level of collaboration and interaction will help a great deal. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Mary.
Yes, thanks, Chief Mulligan.
And I guess just to kind of consolidate my questions / comments, whatever, and consistent with things I've brought up, throughout these meetings is, wanting to make sure that in whatever recommendation we make to City Council and that City Council we hopefully will adopt is something that the foundation of which we can point to Santa Barbara Police Department realities on the ground, how things would work, whether it's the authorities we pick or other recommendations and how they would fit into or not fit into the system here. So based on what you've heard us talk about so far in terms of the model, the conceptual model, I guess, do you have any initial thoughts or perspective on the elements of that? So that would be, I guess, the essence of my question. And if you can't answer tonight, maybe something that would come back to us.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that without getting into I don't know that I want to put my thumb on the scale of the nuts and bolts design that you've been working on the last few weeks, at least not yet. But I will say that I think one of the questions that really I think needs to be answered is what issues or what problems are you trying to solve, or better yet, prevent or head off in the future? And in giving some thought to what I think oversight ought to look like, or how it is based in whatever fashion that you take it, I think one is that the people in the community have to know that they have an alternative place to go besides the police department if they're not comfortable going there, if they're not comfortable with an individual action, or they're not comfortable with sort of a system or a policy or some aspect of how policing is done. And I don't mean in terms of actually the committee or the commission. I'll use the term commission just for the sake of brevity. I don't know what it'll end up being called, but I don't mean the commission doing the investigation as much as the commission being able to, one, either be a third-party complainant, and right now we do take third-party complaints already. So somebody could come to the commission and say, this is a concern that I have, and the commission could direct the police department to investigate it and report back in some fashion. I think that's a critical aspect to know, for people to know that they have a way or sort of around that. I think that one of the second sort of portion of the job is to look at, or the commission's responsibilities is to look at the policies and the systems and do a continual review of what aspects are going on, particularly if something happens in another part of the country. That commission is ideally placed to say, okay, could that happen here? Or how can we make sure that that doesn't happen here? And again, if that discussion happens with the leadership of the police department, I think there's a longer term guarantee of success. And I think I'm talking in generic terms about the audit function and the ability to look at systems and processes and say that this is what we need to do. And I think perhaps most importantly is a continual review of how complaints, even if they don't come to the commission, how is the department handling complaints on a daily basis, on a regular basis, and that continual reporting of what the nature of the complaints were, how they were handled, what the process is, all of that in a public forum, I think guarantees greater transparency. I do think, and again, I stayed away from saying, what is the nuts and bolts? What's the flow chart of how this is going to work? I think that work can continue, and I think or members of the police department are happy to help with that to the degree that the commission wants. One thing I would touch on though, and I think it's an important thing to at least for you to note, and that's that very often the crises that generate increased calls for reform are deadly force incidents, and particularly deadly force incidents where race is an issue or race is a factor. And I think that there needs to be, and I don't have a proposal for you tonight, but I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that those incidents, those type of incidents are, one, incredibly rare, especially here in Santa Barbara, but secondly, that they would be handled, the commission's role in them would be different. And I'm not sure that I know what different would look like. I mean, clearly there would be a reporting, I think, by the police chief or by the department as appropriate. But I get concerned when there's an assumption that all of this can be lumped under one umbrella. So I just thought I'd throw that out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Additional questions for Chief Militant? Christian?
Hi, thanks, Chief, for joining us. The question that I had is about data and collaboration in the potential of this for a future commission and the Santa Barbara Police Department. So I think that when we look at like the perception of the police department, it's inevitably colored by the data that we have available to evaluate like what is, because a lot of people don't think about it, right? And so and some of myself and some other commissioners that were in a working group that I was in, we asked like, what is the status quo of the police department? When you go and you look, you find resources like Campaign Zero's police scorecard, which quite frankly doesn't paint a very good picture of the Santa Barbara Police Department, right? It's not rated very high. It's a 39%, I think, out of a 100% scale, right? And a lot of the reason it seems for that are because Santa Barbara Police Department ultimately didn't share data with this group who is trying to assess the status quo or the excuse me, my dog is, I'm so sorry about that. But so I guess like one of the reasons why the auditor monitor model is particularly interesting for this group and why we have identified it as our preferred model is because of the data, right? Because it involves staff collecting data on police pattern and practice, identifying trends, and then using that data to make proactive recommendations and policy changes to affect outcomes, right? And I guess my question ultimately for you is like, what kind of relationship can we expect a future commission to have with the police department in the sharing of data and in the shared goal of eliminating or reducing misconduct, eliminating or reducing complaints, and holding folks accountable when they do come through?
I think there's two parts to the question, and the one, I looked at the Campaign Zero data, and I'm not even sure where they got some of the things that they wrote, and I can't find anybody in the police department that they actually talked to. But I think that, you know, the issue of Campaign Zero and its accuracy is separate from the more important question you ask, which is, and I agree with totally, that the identification of data and the identification of a dashboard in whatever the community, whatever the commission thinks is important or thinks is necessary for their work. I think I and anybody that comes after me is going to be committed to help gathering that. I actually think that we do a very good job of tracking our complaints. But I'm the first one to admit that I think we could do a lot better in terms, not so much in terms of tracking use of force or tracking complaints that are filed or tracking arrests or arrest pattern. Those things are fairly easy, number one. And secondly, a lot of them are mandated by either federal or state standards. And so there's a kind of a uniform reporting piece. My impression is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're actually looking for something much more nuanced and much more subtle, kind of to what I was saying earlier, that can we identify things before they start to become a problem, and how do we do that? And I think as the commission goes forward over the next few months, my commitment to you is to work with the data committee and try to identify what data points do you think would accomplish the things that you've identified. I think we could do that. I think it's hard work. It's not hard work, but it gets down to some real nuts and bolts things about what do we want to track, what do we want to collect, and I won't go back to my observations about Campaign Zero, but I hope we could do a better job than that. I'll just leave it at that.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just mention that, because I think Campaign Zero is a great and reputable organization. When I saw that, Chairman Alonso, I was alarmed as well, and so I contacted the researchers of Campaign Zero, and they shared with me that data is from 2016, so it's quite outdated. I asked SBPD, and they were able to update that dashboard, which was presented to City Council a couple of times. I know it was presented to the Fire and Police Commission, and it may be on the city website, so perhaps Lieutenant Hill can share that updated data with the commission. And because what you're bringing up is a really good point about perception of community safety, perception of trust with community and law enforcement, our local PD in particular, and when we hear about things that happen on a national level and then we see outdated data, it can't help but contribute to our perception locally. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and I hope Lieutenant Hill will share that updated dashboard.
And we'll come back to you with that.
Lieutenant Hill, did you want to add?
Just wasn't sure if I was supposed to respond at the moment, but just in case, it is true that we have provided some updated information specifically to their early evolution. Campaign Zero has evolved. It's changed a lot. Their early recommendations, like for example, the 8 Can't Wait campaign, we responded to. It's kind of a national police response, and that was shared and posted. It's public on our website. But they have also evolved as an organization and are constantly expanding. So I can't say that we have continually expanded that information with them. Certainly that would be my desire to try to keep up with that, for sure. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Lizzie?
So I have a question for Chief. I'm curious, I know that you've been involved with progressive policing policies for quite some time, probably before it was even defined as progressive policing. So I'm curious what your lessons learned are from developing oversight bodies, and if not your personal lessons learned, maybe the lessons that you've heard from other chiefs.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll be perfectly honest, and there was a time in my career, early in my career, when I didn't understand why most departments, particularly small and mid-sized agencies, needed to have oversight bodies. Most small jurisdictions, my thought was at the time was you've got a local city council, you've got a local government, everybody knows everybody. But my thinking on that has evolved rather significantly over the last 15 or 20 years, because as we moved out of the professional model of policing with that arm's length discussion, I don't think we got into the era of community policing, and I've taken some flack nationally for saying this. I don't think in a lot of places, and I think Santa Barbara is an exception, but I think in a lot of places, community policing was a program. It was not a philosophy. It was not the operating parameter of the individual officer. It was not reflective of culture. So I think the oversight, I think oversight is necessary and I think serves a significant purpose. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that whatever model that there is, it has to acknowledge that the police department has a role to play. Otherwise, it is overly legalistic, and what you get is sort of minimalistic compliance and a continual, legal dance. I think that anything that, and I think the discussion last week, for example, that if there's going to be an investigation, if the commission asks for an investigation on a particular matter, the police department needs to have the opportunity to go and investigate it and come back and report to the commission. And if the commission says that, you know what, we need more information, you didn't answer this question, we need to look at this, that the department gets at least one more bite at that apple to answer those questions so that they're part of the solution and part of addressing the problem. If they're not, then the cultural transformation, which is really, I would assume that the goal, my assumption is it's always been that the goal of oversight was to improve community trust, to increase transparency, and to change the culture of policing. And to change the culture of policing to reflect the community that it serves. And that can't occur if the flow of information and the flow of ideas is only in one direction. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
You have, thank you.
Other questions from the commission? Lisa?
Hi, Chief. Thank you for being here tonight with us. I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question, but Chief, you at the beginning of your speech, you had said that your PhD was in changing policing into, based on values, right? And how do you see our police department changing in that way? As I understand it, for instance, as I understand it right now, the idea of promotions in your police department, a police officer has to, as I understand it, has to give, a number of tickets per month, or they have to be doing a certain number of things that I would view as more negative based. And whereas going out and listening to community members and engaging in listening sessions, that's not considered, at least at this moment, or has yet to be considered as a part of evaluation. Is that something that you see we as a commission could have an impact on, or that's sort of my question. I don't know if that makes any sense.
First of all, it's interesting. One of the things about evaluating police work and police departments is the time lag in information. I think it was certainly true several years ago that the metrics of patrol were based on things like how many arrests did you make, how many tickets did you write, how many field interview. But when Chief Lenau came to Santa Barbara in 2016, she really took some pretty significant steps towards moving the department sort of away from that. And most recently, when I started in March, that was one of the first things I looked at was patrol metrics and what activities are we identifying? How are we it's okay to track the things that I mentioned, but did we track community contacts? Did we track minutes of foot patrol time in neighborhoods or in parks? Did we, how did we do this? So that process is underway. And I think actually the question that you asked, if this was the commission, would be perfect, because one, would give the department the chance to explain what they are doing. And I have no doubt that there are perceptions out there that officers are being evaluated on how many tickets they write, for example, when in point of fact, that other than the officers who are assigned to traffic enforcement on motorcycles aren't really evaluated on that. And so that question could be posed in front of the commission, and the answer, based on the answers that the commission got, there could be a very robust discussion about, well, what are you measuring? What are you telling your officers is important? When I came in this business, like I said, a very long time ago, it was absolutely expected that if you worked patrol, you should write at least 2 moving violations a day. And if you didn't average that, that was a problem. If you worked the night shift, you were expected to average 1 drunk driver a day. You were evaluated on rests. You were evaluated on stops. I think there's a recognition, and the whole NYPD discussion about stop and frisk really brought that to the front. About if you can't just, if you're just measuring stops, if you're just measuring enforcement activity, then you're not building relationships, and you're not doing anything to do this sort of cultural cross-pollination kind of thing. So I think your question is a very good one, and I think that would be that, measuring that continually, because one of the realities, and I don't know whether some of you would agree with me or not, but the commission that you design this year, in 5 or 10 years, may need to look different. It may, the expectations of the community 10 years from now may be very different than what they are today. And hopefully the commission will keep pace with that. And whatever those priorities are will be redefined based on the community climate at the time.
Thank you.
Other commissioner questions? All right, I have one, Chief. Oh, Christian, go ahead. And then
Go
Kim.
ahead, Chair. I'll wait. I already asked one.
Kim, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Chief, on what you just mentioned regarding officers building relationships, can you talk a bit more about what you see the role of relationship building with the community? Like, what role does that serve with your team?
There's a whole field of study about role playing, and about, we all have jobs, and in those jobs we take on what we think is the role or the characteristics of it. And when I talk about, when I came in this business, and it was the professional model, and it was for those of you that might remember, it was the Jack Webb, just the facts, ma'am approach. The idea of relationship building was not in any discussion whatsoever. It was just about enforcing the law. Community policing said that you were supposed to do 2 things, or 3 things actually. You were supposed to build relationships. This was a responsibility of the police department, to build relationships with the community they serve, to identify and solve neighborhood problems. And the third piece that never got talked about very much, but the third piece was, in so doing, to transform the culture of the policing agency. This issue of how officers are supposed to behave, and the requirements of the requirements of the job and emphasis on officer safety and those things can get in the way of relationships. Can get, because if your continual approach is, if the culture of the organization is that you are in effect at war with the community that you're serving, that danger lurks around every corner, then you can only go so far in terms of building relationships with people. On the other hand, and I think this department reflects it, if you can recognize that my first training officer told me that in this job, I was going to see good people at their worst and bad people at their best. And that might be an oversimplification to some degree, but it was a true statement in terms of the complexity of human behavior. And the problem with the old professional model of training and of not building relationships was that you weren't trying to find out what was driving people. You were only concerned with this sort of two-dimensional aspect of what they were doing. I think the question that Commissioner Wood asked about what do we measure, what things are we identifying are important? Things like foot patrols in parks, things like non-enforcement contacts. Those kind of metrics are about relationship building and are recognizing that the officers, for better and for worse. Bernie Park said that when he was chief of LAPD, he said the biggest problem was with trying to run an organization was you had to recruit your officers from the human race. They run this dynamic. If we can move out of this, and I think we are. I really do think that the profession in general has moved away from that professional model, and certainly Santa Barbara has, with this emphasis on recognizing our common humanity.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in with the question if the commission doesn't mind. It was brought up earlier, collaborative reform, and for the future oversight body, I'm curious, in your opinion, what is your definition of access to records? In other words, what would be available to the oversight body? I know that we have now body cams coming soon. We have investigation materials. What, in your mind, would be shared with the oversight body?
I think that anything that was not legally restricted or not part of an active investigation, whether that was a criminal investigation or an active internal investigation, would likely be made available in response to inquiries from the commission. And I think that's one of the earlier question about data. I think the identification of what data points are critical and important, what metrics, measurement metrics are important. I think so there's that. I mean, there's the data piece and what those records are. And I think that's the simpler of the two. Probably the more complex question is if there is an incident that is of significant public interest, how do we make material available to the commission? Because in actuality, the commission is a public body. So anything that is presented to the commission, unless we can get some legal, some sort of legal parameters around a closed session or whatever that version would be, is available to the public. And so that would be, figuring out how to balance everybody's interest in that would probably be the biggest single sort of impediment to absolute release.
And a follow-up, thank you for that. And I have a follow-up. As it relates to working that out in a policy, have you started to do that work, creating a policy on if we did have a unfortunate incident. We had one in Santa Barbara County recently. If it was similar to that, have you begun work on a policy on how you would release that information, or what sort of timelines you're looking at to release pertinent information for a situation like that?
I have actually. We've been working on that for a couple of months. The law gives a lot of latitude in terms of how much time the police department can hold on to things. But for example, if there was an officer-involved shooting, and obviously each case is slightly different, but assuming that you don't have any factors such as a threat to the officer's life or something, I've said that we would probably identify. One is that we would begin making public releases of information almost immediately. The officers would probably be identified by name in roughly 5 to 10 days, and that if there was video or a detailed sort of explanation of what had occurred, would be, my goal would be to try to do that within 2 to 4 weeks, in a very, and I did it when I was down in Pasadena. I did it twice on significant incidents where we had a public presentation of what actually occurred, a PowerPoint of walking through exactly what happened. So that policy has been developed. I'm knocking on wood, we haven't had to test it yet, but the plan is definitely there.
Thank you, Chief. Lizzie, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, if you were on the commission, on this formation commission, Chief, what would be some of your primary recommendations that you would like to see in an oversight body?
Well, I think Commissioner Alonso's focus on data and what data points we should actually be gathering and what should be up on a public dashboard. I think that's critically important. I think the issue of patrol metrics and patrol conduct that was brought up, I think is important. And I think a mechanism for reporting out on major incidents of public concern in a way that informs the public but doesn't jeopardize the individual officer and doesn't jeopardize a criminal prosecution. I think those three things would be a big place to start. And then probably the fourth piece would be an auditing of policy and systems. I actually think that on the collaborative side of things, I think the ability of the chief or the department to work with the commission to say, you know what, these are areas that we're concerned about. For example, right now we have a major staffing problem. We are 30% understaffed, and that is going to have a significant impact on how we deliver services over the next few months. And I think the commission would be an ideal place to have that discussion and to get some input about, one, what we're thinking about doing, and two, to get some other input about, well, have you thought about this or have you thought about that? So that'd probably keep me busy for a month or two anyway.
Can I follow up on that? So I like that you a focus was a mechanism for reporting out on public concern for certain things while not compromising investigations, and then also auditing policy. So I'm thinking about the situation, or that the sad, really quite sad homicide that occurred locally on the Lower East Side a few months ago, and there was conversation that maybe the Goleta case was solved quicker than the Santa Barbara case, and the department was really unable to share details because of that. So, because it was an ongoing investigation. So let's say that the commission did a review of the policy on what type of information could be shared when. and came up with a recommendation. Hypothetically, how long would it take for the department to receive that recommendation, accept it, and then implement it?
You know, at the risk of sounding like I'm trying to dance around the question, I'll give the lawyer's best answer, which it depends. The case, for example, in question could probably be discussed at some length, but not until after those arrests were made, you know, and in some cases, not until the people had gone to trial and were either convicted or acquitted. There were some very, for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of police work, the sheriff's office had more information available to them in the Goleta case in a much shorter period of time than Santa Barbara did, the PD did. And while we had identified possible suspects, and it turned out we were correct, we did not have enough legal grounds to make an arrest, and we were working with the DA's office on building that. So my perception would be that at some point, whenever it was appropriate to do so, and even during the case, I would assume that given the public pressure, you know, about that matter, that the commission would be asking the police chief what's going on, and the police chief would provide the answers that he or she could. But when the incident was resolved, or at least, you know, had moved beyond that point, then I think we get to the place of your policy discussion. Well, why not? You know, why couldn't you answer question X or question Y? And then we'd have, you know, a discussion and about your thoughts on the commission's thoughts on the matter, and the police department would offer its explanation and what the law is. And presumably, and that's that whole collaborative reform piece, we'd come to a place that works. In this case, I think when this was over, it would have been relatively easy to explain why the Liberty Street homicide arrest took longer than the Goleta shooting did. It was not from lack of interest. It was not from lack of commitment of resources. It really had to do with legal evidence that was available. But I know that there are community questions about that. I got a question. I visited the mother of one of the homicide victims, and and her question was, because if you remember, unfortunately, we had another homicide on Ocean View not too long after that, and there was because it occurred at 5 o'clock in the evening, and because of just the nature of what happened, there was a massive response to that, including a sheriff's helicopter and a bunch of other things. And the mother of one of the Liberty Street victims was really troubled by how come there wasn't a helicopter, when her son was killed? How come there wasn't this presence? And I understand that question, and I understand that grief, but that I think the commission could have helped frame that, and maybe could have helped give the department, give the police chief a place to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think, just for the record, I think that's when I was talking about policy, that's specifically what I meant, not necessarily divulging the details of the investigation, but having a policy of when a crime involves a homicide, or a crime involves a young person or a person of color, that the department will share with the public something, or reach out to the family of the victims immediately after, something, so that it's not necessarily a policy of, assuming that officers aren't doing a good job, but in a way that addresses public perception, public concern, and really the victims of the crime. So just so you know, that's what I was referring to, because policy change comes in such a variety, a continuum of elements.
Well, and that's exactly what I was referring to earlier. I think right now one of the things that's missing is a forum for that discussion to take place, and it takes place. It may take place individually, between either an individual detective or if the police chief, takes it on him or herself to go out and do something. But there's really no forum for that to take place, and I think the commission could serve that role.
Mayor?
Yeah, just along those lines, and this is something that I've thought of a couple times in our meetings, but Chief Mulligan, what you bring up raises this again. Wondering if there would be any value to us at some point engaging the district attorney's office in some of these discussions, since I know from being on some other sides of things that sometimes they're the people in the background telling you what you can or cannot say, but they're not up front dealing with the public. I could be wrong, but that's been my experience. So
I think we both know you're not.
So how do you see any willingness to, to engage from them, or is it really a case-by-case basis?
I don't know if I can answer that. I understand what the district attorneys, and I don't mean just our district attorney, but district attorneys in the aggregate. I understand what their concerns are. Their focus is on building a legally sound case for prosecution of people who have been identified as suspects. Their arena, if you will, their forum is the courtroom. And it's really what's interesting is, all the discussion around mass incarceration and incarceration of people of color and all that. It's really only been in the last 10 years that that our society really has started to figure out that the police are not really the gatekeepers of this. The district attorney's offices are the gatekeepers of this. The police department and police officers deal with situations that are presented to them. So whether or not that kind of discussion could take place in an environment where, and without jeopardizing the prosecution of a particular case, I'd have to defer to them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Christian?
Yeah, thank you. So this one is kind of a crazy one, so bear with me here. In terms of, and I don't know that this has been asked yet, but I'm curious about civilian non-sworn employees of the police department. And maybe Mr. Doimus or Lieutenant Hill or Cami jump in here to answer this question, but I feel like a lot of what we've discussed up until this point has been exclusively focused on sworn officers and sworn officers' conduct. Do we expect that this type of oversight, or Cami, does any oversight also take into consideration non-sworn civilian employees of the police department? And are they subject to COBRA as well? That's my question. I have some follow-ups.
Well, I don't know, Cami, if you want to talk about other places. I will tell you that I think that it does. I do think that the difference between I prefer the term professional staff. We've gone around about civilians and non-sworn and other things, but they really are professional. The difference is that most of the non-sworn position, most of the professional staff position are very specialized. So they are dispatchers, or they are parking checkers, or they are records clerks, or they are animal control officers, et cetera, et cetera. And they tend to be focused in that bucket. And it's interesting, Santa Barbara, when I got here, they were extended POBAR protections, which I never understood because I've never seen that anywhere else. But when I compared it, and I've worked with John Doimus on this, when I compared it to what sort of protections in terms of process that the city charter guarantees all employees, there really wasn't that much difference. the reason that these discussions tend to focus on the sworn is because they're the people who are interacting with the public in a way that, you know, can deprive you of your liberty. You can be arrested. You can, you know, they're really the only agents of the department for the most part who are going to use force. So I think you're, in terms of, if I understood your broader question, certainly the commission, when it looks at policies or practices, would be looking at the totality of the department. And I think, for example, and if we had more time, we could have a whole discussion on the role of dispatch and how the processing of information and the dispatching of radio calls, you know, how it influences outcomes in the field. And I think that would be, that would fall exactly into that category of the commission's review of the department's activities and practices. Cammie, I don't know if you had something else about that.
All that I would add is that yes, there are oversight entities who their jurisdiction includes professional staff or non-sworn, depending on the language used. And some also include the ability to accept complaints from officers themselves. So it's really more about what your recommendations include, because there are examples of all of those things out there.
Yeah, thank you both so much, and that's really interesting. And I'm kind of, the reason why I'm thinking about it through the course of this discussion is because of a very specific and very public misconduct allegation with the Santa Barbara Police Department recently, with a civilian non-sworn employee of the department, and I didn't know until that was reported on that non-sworn employees are issued a badge and a uniform. And I was just curious about like the need for that, right? And because the specific misconduct allegation was that the employee of the police department like flashed their badge, and I don't want to spread misinformation. You can read about the details of the complaint. But the specific allegation was that they had flashed their badge in an abusive way to a Latino small business owner here in town. And so, like, what is the reason that a non-sworn civilian employee would have a badge is the question.
The decision about that was made, from my understanding, probably 20 or more years ago. There was one of the issues in police departments around the country. Going back in the time capsule again, when I first started, the police department was probably 90% sworn. So you had sworn people answering the phones, you had sworn people dispatching, you had sworn people working in the jail, you had sworn people working in records. And there was a recognition that, you know what, this is not a good use of space. And so over time, now most departments are somewhere between 50 and 60% sworn, and the rest are professional staff. But one of the ongoing complaints for almost as long as this process has been underway is that the professional staff and police departments felt like second-class citizens, that somehow they didn't count, they weren't important, their work wasn't as valued. And so for reasons I don't know, 20 or more years ago, the decision was made to issue non-sworn employees badges that included, you know, a title of their. Now, there is a restriction on it. In the case that you mentioned, there was a policy violation. And just for clarity for everybody else, that situation, there was discipline that came out of that. So it did not go, you know, and it already, I walked into that one the first week I was on the job. So I'm very familiar with that. I don't agree with the notion of issuing badges. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. The issue of uniforms is they're not really uniforms in the sense that police officers are. But for example, if you went into dispatch, they might have a departmental polo shirt on, or they can wear their civilian clothes. The same as in the Records Bureau. Now, the people who are public facing, the animal control officers, for example, do have a uniform. It's very different than the police. There's no confusion about it. But that's to basically identify, to convey that they do have the authority of the city to do what they're doing. But again, going back to what the commission's role would be, I think if that incident had come out and we'd had a commission and you were on that commission and said, why are we issuing badges? I think we'd have to have a discussion about that.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I bring it up, Chief, and I appreciate you digressing with me on that point for a moment, because it, seems kind of unrelated. But the reason I bring it up, and to your point about systems, right, is that the systems aren't just the officers, right? It's dispatch, like you brought up, which is not something that I had considered either. But I think it's really important as we look at the model and how it will serve the city and the folks that are under the jurisdiction of the police department, that we take into consideration how people interact with everybody employed by the police department, not just officers as well, and look at those systemic processes that either need improvement or can be eliminated or are arbitrary or duplicative or whatever, right?
Concur. And I think, one of the questions that got asked last week, and I want to make a point of comment. I think one of the things, the issues come up about the airport police and the harbor police. And I think there are some systems issues that could be standardized very easily. And I've talked to the heads of both agencies about that would bring policies and practices into alignment with the police department without jeopardizing the distinct roles that they play.
And you will share that with us?
I'm sorry?
And you will share those ideas with us?
Of course.
Okay, great.
All right, so we are at our hour.
Wait, I have something to say. I apologize just because my camera's not on. And I know we're coming up at our time, so I'll try to keep it as brief because there's so much I want to say. This is Ana Cepeda. So there was a couple of points that you mentioned about patterns and about like old ways of thinking and how things were conducted previously. And obviously we know that a lot of like law enforcement or individuals who have that old, quote unquote, like old way of thinking mentality are still in the force, and they may not be as receptive to the changes or to the implementations, or may push back or whatever it may be. And so when those occurrences happen, how can we hold that law enforcement accountable for those situations, And another thing, in regards to the park patrol, it's like, where are those park patrols going to be located? They're going to be located most likely in areas where there's a lot of BIPOC folks, right? And so it's like, and then it goes back again to like, why are these why is it needed in these patrols, like why do we even need them there, And so it's like, how can we change that so that we don't need these patrolmen, so that we are contacting like mental health professionals, trying to really implement like different ways of finding solutions, right? And so because that may be seen as a threat or may escalate, or with different occurrences that we have seen throughout, and not just within the past year or the year before. These are occurrences that have occurred in different situations and here in Santa Barbara. I'm not just speaking like in LA or in other areas. These are situations, and it's not a rarity. Like, for example, there was a report that was sent out through the Santa Barbara Police Department where it had stats about how, there's a larger amount of people of color who are targeted by law enforcement here in Santa Barbara. And so it's like, how can we implement this and make sure that people are being held accountable, our recommendations are being executed, And we are pushing forward with something that is going to systemically change, and not just like, oh, here's our recommendations and nothing occurs, or there's a lot of pushback by individuals who have that old mindset, right? So that's all I have to say about that.
And I'm not, I don't want to minimize your concern, but I will say that whatever the recommendations are, whatever the oversight body looks like, regardless of whether an individual officer doesn't believe that he or she should be held accountable, they will be. They are. I mean, that's the profession. The profession that I came into 48 years ago looks nothing like what the profession looks like today. And I suspect that the profession of today will look nothing like what it will look like in 10, 15 years from now. Because when you put the commission in place and you do provide an avenue for people to express those concerns or to ask questions about, well, why did you pick this park and not that park, or why, you know, whatever those issues might be, it strikes me that the commission's job is to have the police chief explain why are we doing this, and should we be doing this? I mean, those are two basic questions, and so I think the short answer to your question about how do we change this is how do we define this commission, and how do we what tasks do we give it? But at the risk of repeating myself, we do it in collaboration with the department. We do recognize that the overwhelming majority of the men and women that work in the Santa Barbara Police Department go to work every day with the best of intentions and do the best to de-escalate everything that they can. The issue about whether or not, we call mental health professionals over law enforcement, I don't think you'll find a police chief in America that doesn't think that's a good idea. So.
Thank you, Chief Millikan. So with that concludes the questions and answers portion. Chief Millikan, thank you for taking all of our questions. If the commission would like to do this again in the future, we can definitely schedule that and make that a part of the agenda.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your time and taking the time to listen to me and to ask the questions that you did. I found them probing and informative, and I hope we have more opportunity to do this.
Thank you, Chief. And so before we move on to our next item, we are going to open up public comment. Sam, is there anyone from the public that would like to make public comment on the question and answers with the police chief?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe there's a hand raised for any members of the public that wish to ask a question or make a comment. Please raise your hand in the app feature. So I believe Simone Ruskamp has a question. Just 1 second. You are unmuted, Simone. You have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. So members of the Formation Commission, I'm just thinking again of this is really, really why I'm pushing you all to ask for community advocates and activists who are able to respond to and even address some of the things that are brought forth by the police department, in which cases are not true or misleading. As Commissioner Anna mentioned, right, in response to what the chief was saying, which was that you all are not meeting in response to a crisis, you would saying it's not a crisis, you would say, well, a crisis for who? Right? The Santa Barbara Independent, right, just a few months ago, released data based on what the police department was saying, right, that even though Santa Barbara's population was only 1.3% Black, 8.7% of the time, they were targets of force. They even have documented the type of force that was used against Black folks. So when the chief is saying you're not meeting in response to a crisis, you need to ask, is that true? Why were tanks being brought out against high schoolers protesting for ethnic studies? Why, when Crystal and I were in the street, were armed vehicles brought out? So yes, there was a crisis. So often in Santa Barbara, you all try to deflect and say these things don't happen here, but they do. And that is why you are on the Formation Commission. I'm incredibly worried as well to hear the chief talking about you all as if you are the PR for the police department, which is inappropriate and unethical. And we know that it is unethical because Anthony Wagner was on a police review commission in San Diego before being recruited to be the PR person for the chief and the police department in Santa Barbara. We know that this does not work well, and we must do better. So I would say, again, when you're talking about here, about use of force policies and talking about the low grade that the police department got, and you have the chief saying, well, no one in the department was asked, because no one had to be asked. The use of force policy is public. You can read it because it's on the police department website. So when the police department was rated, it was saying, do you have these things that protect life? And our police department was missing several of those suggestions. You all should know this if you invited community to present on what they've been doing, because Equity for SB presented all of these same policy suggestions to the police department for years, and they were incredibly resistant. So only asking officers to work on this in bits and pieces at a time before retirement and not taking it seriously. So this is again why I would pressure you all to really consider why it is that you keep giving so much space to people who are either paid by police or police to answer honestly about what has been going on, especially when those same people are trying to convince you that there has been no harm. And we have the data to suggest that there has been.
That's 3 minutes, Simone. Thank you. There is another question, Mr. Chair, from Crystal Seeger. Crystal, I am unmuting you. Give me 1 second.
Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm on my phone, so slow. Last minute complicated. Hello, everyone. On the Formation Commission, this is my first time attending one of the meetings. I'm Crystal Seagart, one of the founders of Healing Justice Santa Barbara. I just wanted to call in support of the commission adopting a hybrid model. I just think in these times when we're thinking about what police oversight looks like in Santa Barbara, we need to make sure to consider as many different options as we can, especially those ones backed up, by quality research. And in this community, we've just had a lot of issues specifically with the police department and a lot of their internal investigations. So I think moving forward, when we're thinking of what that looks like here, we need to bring in as much different models as possible. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam, do we have any other public commenters?
Give me 1 second, Mr. Chair. Anybody wishing to speak, please raise your hand. There are no further questions or comments.
Okay. And so with that, we will close out this item. And before we move on to the next item, I want to gauge whether or not we should probably take a break at some point tonight, even if it's 10 to 15 minutes. Do we want to do it now before we get our presentation from John Doimus, or would you prefer after that presentation and before our discussion? Is there any preference?
How long is
Personally-
John's presentation?
John, how long would you say your presentation would be?
Chair, maybe 20 to 25 minutes tops.
Maybe after?
Okay. Does that sound good with everyone?
After as well.
Okay, sounds great. So we'll move on to the next item. and this is going to be a presentation on legal and policy considerations for the development of the review board, where we will receive a presentation from Assistant City Attorney John Doimus on some legal limitations concerning employee rights, personnel files, and how California's open meeting laws relate to these issues for the commission to consider as they discuss the review board's authority. And I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Doimus.
Thank you, Chair Escobedo. Good evening, Commission. Can you hear me all well or not? Just want to make sure. Sometimes I'm always worried about the sound coming in through well. Thank you. I want to take a time to kind of focus. When I initially did a presentation a couple months ago, I did cover a little bit on Police Officer Bill of Rights, personnel records, and pitches, and didn't talk too much about Brown Act and deliberations. I'll touch on that more tonight. But I wanted to go in more depth on these laws and policies to give a background. I'm sure Lieutenant Hill, during his course of meeting with the group sessions, has maybe gone and covered some of this ground, so I apologize. This is one area I want to cover for the commission, and a final area in the future I would like to cover would be talking maybe about the authorities of the Fire and Police Commission, Civil Service, the process of, ordinances, charter, and maybe working with Cami to develop different examples of some ordinances or charters, just to show what it looks like in terms of how it may help in recommendation and what the legal and the administrative process is for that. So looking forward to that final presentation in the near future. So this one, again, I trying to be creative. I noticed a lot of P's, so I just called it the P's to be aware of in terms of POBAR, personal records, pitches, and privacy. Next slide, please. Or Sam, do you want me to do it? I don't know if I could. Okay, perfect. You got it. All right, I'll just go that way. I wanted to just point this out before I started, and I think it's really important for this commission to understand, and I have some news on this. It's Senate Bill 2. In fact, today it was passed by the Senate, so passed the House Assembly last week, passed the Senate, so now the governor has till October 10th to sign it, and it becomes law. And what this bill does is to aim and increase accountability of law enforcement officers that commit serious misconduct, excessive force, dishonesty. There's a whole list of serious misconduct issues in the bill. Can you go to the next slide, please, Sam? And what this law does, it gives the Commission on Peace Officer Standards, what we call POST, the authority to revoke an officer's eligibility to be a police officer due to these. And here's some of, you see on the slide there, some of the examples of serious misconduct. So what it means is, and it also could be for demonstrating bias. So what this means is, let's say an officer is let go or found by Civil Service Commission or whatever body could be that they committed a serious misconduct. They can't then go around to a different agency in the state of California and be a police officer. The commission would be tasked with keeping track of this and revoking their eligibility. So if they're no longer eligible to be an officer in Santa Barbara, they can't be an officer in Fresno or wherever it may be. So it's a very important bill. We'll see if it passes on October 10th. And if it does, I'll let the commission know in an email. And also I was thinking of that, maybe also doing part of my last presentation, some of the bills that are coming forward in the past year. There's been a flurry dealing with police departments in general. But this is, I think, a really important one. I think the commission would be really interested in this Senate Bill 2, because it takes eligibility away of police officers if they're found guilty of misconduct to be an officer in another jurisdiction. Next slide. So what we covered today, I wanted to start off with the Police Officer Bill of Rights, going into then police officer personnel records, and finally some Brown Act considerations. So these are 3 areas I'll be covering. Next slide, please. So the first one is Police Officer Bill of Rights, the acronym for it, POBAR, was passed in 1976 and is codified in the California Government Code under 3300 to 3313. Firefighters have a similar, they're called Firefighter Bill of Rights, or FOBAR, as well. And the legislative intent was that it was to ensure investigations remain private, but also to offer several protections to officers. And the question is why, and you'll see the same thing in terms of pitches too. Why are these procedures or processes? Well, I think one has to look at what the nature of the position itself, right? Being a police officer is different from being a planner or a city engineer. You know, number one, the powers that you have, right? The power to arrest someone. You carry a gun, right? With those come important responsibilities. And so complaints are made too against police officers, as we know. There's a process for that. Maybe there will be complaints made against a city planner or city engineer, but there's no requirement that's kept on file. And usually it's not discoverable that those employees have privacy rights. The only time probably you would be able to go outside and see that if there's a lawsuit and a subpoena was issued. But for police officers, it's different, right? Complaints are made, and there may be a right needed for criminal defendants to see past misconduct. But because of that, there are these processes and protections for due process. So the goal of it is understanding that police officers or peace officers are unique from other type of employees in terms of the powers they have, and there may be a public need or necessity to see this, but there also still has to be a balancing of that with the rights that other employees enjoy. And so that's basically the intent of a lot of these processes and procedures I'll be talking about tonight. Next slide, please. So POBAR applies to nearly every sworn officer. There's a designation in the penal code. So for our purposes, it applies to all our peace officers here in the city. So our police department, harbor patrol, airport patrol, and park rangers. Next slide, please. And when does this protection invoke? POBAR comes into play when an officer is under investigation and subject to interrogation that could lead to punishment, right? Does not apply to, I think it's important there, to questioning a normal scope of business when you're asking about a situation. So how does this come up? There's a case that kind of explains this, and it's a unique fact pattern. What occurred was when a police officer went by a fatal car accident scene. No first responders were there. He didn't stop and render aid. It was in his jurisdiction, didn't go to it. The humorous part about it, kind of a stereotype, is the officer instead passed it and went to a donut shop. Now, the interesting thing was a caller called into the complainant called into the police department and complained about it. It was actually the owner of a donut shop owner across the street. I guess, I don't know if he was mad they didn't come to his shop, but it was very upset that this officer didn't render aid and didn't stop and knew who the officer was and called the desk sergeant at the time. Desk sergeant then had knowledge that if this was true, the officer didn't render aid, it would be a violation of policy. So he started interrogating the officer about what happened. The court ruled at that point that the officer, the sergeant in mind, committed a POBAR violation because he knew the questioning and the responses that were used would probably lead to punitive action. So what happened with that all the statements that were made by that officer in terms of confessing what he did could not be used, were stricken. They had to redo it and get by other means, and there are fines to the department if it's a willful misconduct. I can't remember if that case they found a willful misconduct, but that's $10,000 for each violation under the Act. So what does this mean? You can ask questions from an officer if you're a superior, a supervisor, about what's going on in terms of routine issues, you know, what happened on this call. But if something in the line of questioning rings a bell in a response that, this route may come down to punitive action, you're supposed to stop and then allow the POBAR protections we'll talk about, where they can have a right to representation, notice of potential violations. You have to do that. In this case, the officer, the sergeant, knew that he had information or insight that the officer was committing a wrongdoing. So that's why in that case, he should have probably never began the questioning. There are times though, when we train our sergeants, our lieutenants, our captains, when you're asking questions, you may not now have this side information in terms of someone calling up making a complaint. You may just want to know what happened on the field. But if you understand some of the responses that, this may go down to a punitive level that there was some misconduct, at that point you need to stop and stop the questioning regarding that officer's actions. Next slide, please. I mentioned interview notice. One of the things that an officer has a right to know, this is very important. It's required that the officer knows the nature of the investigation, and it can be done several ways. One way is just giving a brief description of what you're investigating. So in the case I mentioned, that you didn't render aid at a fatal car accident scene when there was no first responders, right? You could instead write the policy sections. Santa Barbara Police Department has the Santa Barbara Police Department policy manual. You could write those sections you believe that officer violated, or you can do a little bit of both, right? But you have to provide what, kind of give a little bit of a description of what you're going to be inquiring about in the interview. You have to provide the name of the interviewers, who's going to be present, the rank, and we include these, it's really important, the duty for the officer to be truthful and forthcoming in his answers, his right to record, that we're going to be recording, obviously right to representation, and then any retaliation is prohibited. So the officer can't retaliate or intimidate other witnesses that may be part of this investigation. Next slide, please. The officer is entitled to have a representative of his or her choice. It cannot be obviously the person who's a subject of the same investigation, or usually even a witness. The representative must be reasonably available. So what does that mean? There have been cases on this. You know, maybe 1 hour and after an incident, if you want to start an investigation, that's not reasonable. But a week is fine. You know, an officer can't delay it several weeks. You know, there was one case where there was an officer shooting, and they wanted to get the responses very quickly. It's important, you know, in terms of this traumatic event and then memory issues afterwards. So a court ruled one time 10 hours after the shooting was enough or reasonably available to have someone there. So it's important to give some time, but, you know, the department has a right to begin and initiate an investigation promptly. Next slide, please. This is really important and kind of an interesting issue. When you interview the subject, there's no disclosures of documents required. All you have to do is give the notice of what you're going to be interviewing, who's going to be there, like we just talked about, and begin the interview. But if you have to interview the subject officer a second time, they automatically, under the government code, under POBAR, they have access to a tape recording of their interviews, and if there have been any transcription of notes or their interview, they would be entitled to that. However, there was a case in 2017 in the 4th District of California out of Santa Ana that said, no, we read POBAR to mean if you have to interview the subject officer a second time, they're entitled to everything. They're entitled to the other people who've been interviewed, notes and interviews or recordings, any notes of the investigator. So essentially, when this decision came out, in order to strategize an investigation, it was really important that you interview the subject officer one time, because if you had to do it a second time, they can be entitled to all the documents that you've gathered during this investigation. Now, in this year, a case came out in Oakland in the 1st District of California that said, no, we're going to go back to the old reading of POBAR, that what I just read above, that they're only entitled to their tape recording, not the officer's documents. Now, Santa Barbara is in the 2nd District, right? So since there is a split decision, City of Santa Barbara can choose to follow either one. You know, right now the California Supreme Court has not taken up this issue. So the argument is California can, you know, follow the Oakland case, and if there was a challenge on it, they could use the Oakland case as trying to persuade the local court here that they shouldn't be entitled to it, or it could be vice versa. So I just wanted to point that important issue in these two cases on that. Next slide, please.
John,
yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I asked this before the meeting, but for the benefit of the public and the fellow commissioners, if Sam, if we could go to the last slide. So for the purposes of what we're trying to do in establishing a civilian oversight, for that first court decision, the Santa Ana Police Officers Association versus the City of Santa Ana, if we were to give the review body or the oversight body the ability to initiate an independent investigation, would the interviews from that independent investigation count towards be an additional interview, in which case if we were following the first court case, we would have to give all of the documents that we had, including interviews of other people and investigator notes, all of that?
Obviously it would come down to a local judge deciding it. My opinion on it would be, I think if it's the same matter, a judge would, following the Santa Ana decision, would review that, and they were already interviewed by the police department, and they were interviewed again over the same issue, same matter, by a commission's investigator, that they would say, yep, this is the second time, same matter. I don't care if it's a different form of agency. You have the police department, now you have a commission, they're entitled to everything. So that, if I had to venture a strong guess of what a court would do if they were following the Santa Ana decision, I would say they would say, yes, that counts as number 2.
And if we, well, I'm guessing as a jurisdiction, we would choose to follow the second decision from earlier this year with Oakland.
Obviously, you want to keep these documents. You don't want to provide all these documents before a second interview. So yes, we would probably try to rely on the Oakland case, at least to protect those records.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide. And just here's some typical interview rules. Obviously, the statute provides, POBAR provides no more than 2 people asking questions at a time. It has to be conducted at a reasonable hour and time. So you can't sit there and knock on an officer's door at 3 in the morning and start doing this. Witness must be compensated, so it's paid time, work time when they're being interviewed, not during their off time. Obviously, and with any good interview, you shouldn't be making any threats or using offensive language. What's interesting is there's no California cases that have defined what the representative may be. Obviously, it can't be obstructive. They may speak up in an interview, but there are really no, objections. You're not to answer that type of questions. The only things that are generally respected and off limits is the conversations that a representative may have with the officer. Many times a representative is a lawyer, and so we respect the attorney-client communication on that, and that's just their communications. But outside of that, there really are no objections to be made from a representative. Like I said, sometimes they're actually helpful. Maybe a question comes across confusing, and they say, "Hey, maybe let me try to help. Is this what you're asking about?" And the interviewer maybe say yes, and that will help his client in that case. Next slide, please. This is the investigation timeline. Obviously, we have a 1 year for the majority of matters that we're investigating. It's a 1 year, and the timeline starts when someone who's authorized to initiate an investigation, that covers a lot of people in our police department, discovers an allegation, and generally supervisors, so sergeants, lieutenants, captains. And that timeline begins once we have notice that there's a violation, and we have 1 year to provide the actual notice of intent of discipline, whether it be a written reprimand, a suspension, a termination. That has to be in hand. Now, after that, you may have a Skelly hearing, as I mentioned before, in a civil service. That could be later, and that's fine. That doesn't have to be, those things do not have to be held within the year timeline. But the actual notice of what the department is recommending for discipline, that has to be given within a year once we discover an allegation of a violation. Next slide, please. And here are some of the exceptions for that 1 year where it could be told pending criminal investigation into the officer, employees who's maybe out sick or hurt or injured. Obviously, that time won't count. If there's civil litigation where the officer is named as a defendant in a case, or workers' compensation fraud, are some of the examples where you do not have to have the notice of intent of discipline within a year. Next slide, please. And finally on this, investigation can be reopened if significant new evidence has been discovered and likely to affect the outcome of the investigation, and that evidence could not have been discovered during the investigation period, reasonably discovered, or the evidence resulted from the respondent's pre-disciplinary response or procedure. That maybe afterwards, let's say you have a written reprimand and the officer chooses to issue a written response to it and makes an admission of something, then you can reopen it. Obviously a rare occurrence, but it's there in the statute. Next slide, please. I think now we're going to be beginning peace officer personnel records. Yes. As I mentioned kind of before, I gave what the intent is. What's the balancing act here? There is a need to know these records, especially, criminal defendants, having what's called Brady material, exculpatory material to show that would help them in the defense. If this officer has 3 or 4 cases of excessive force or shown bias, he's maybe doing it to me, and I need to know that record in his or her past. The privacy of personnel records is codified in California Penal Code Section 832.7, and they are confidential and shall not be disclosed in any criminal civil proceeding except the discovery pursuant to Evidence Code 1043 and 46. And don't worry, I'll go into that right now. Next slide, please.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when we're talking about POBAR, we're talking about internal investigations, right? So
correct.
When something happens after every significant event, there is an interview, a reporting of what took place. This is when POBAR is highly followed and highly, attended to. If it's not a criminal case, are those files permanently closed so that if, let's say that, situation of the county, for example, where one officer has like repeated situations where there's excessive use of force and a death involved. So are those cases then able to be reopened for that particular investigation to say this person has a pattern?
I think if you're asked, if I get the gist, Commissioner Rodriguez, what you're saying is, can they be reopened when the conclusion of the criminal case?
Well, actually, before the criminal case.
Before the criminal case, usually the best way to deal with that situation, strategic-wise, getting a POBAR is when you have a criminal case against an officer and you don't have to worry about the 1-year statute of limitations. What you would want to do is let the criminal case go first and let that being resolved, because that may sometimes take care of itself before you initiate the internal affairs investigation. You can do both parallel. The one important thing when you do that too is you have to wall off the administrative side versus the criminal side, because you can't let the administrative side influence the criminal case or vice versa against the officer. You can't use it to, hey, let's pressure the officer this way or that way. So it's very important that a wall is put up in all levels within the police department, and even if it's the city attorney's office, there maybe needs to be a wall if there needs to be advice on the criminal case versus the administrative matter. So that's typically how that's handled. I don't know if that answered your question, if that's what you're kind of
getting. I'm just thinking of like criminal cases usually take a very long time to close. And so let's say that it's a 5, 6, 10-year investigation that it's taking, and this person, maybe has another, maybe 2 years after. You can't look at the previous interviews to see if there's a pattern. Is that what I'm understanding?
And the criminal case?
No, so I'm assuming that a complaint will come to us before it becomes, not us. The complaint will come to a oversight body before it goes to a criminal case. So as an oversight body investigating this complaint, are they then able to look at previous complaints that may be under investigation?
I understand. You know what? I will get to that actually that question in like 3 slides. When I get to that, can I address it then? Perfect. Now I get what you're asking. Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. I'll get to that in one short second, because it's a very interesting question and one that I think is still in flux. It's a very interesting point, so very perceptive on that. Let me go into what personnel records are. The penal code defines them. So here's what was considered private, right? Personal data, medical history, reviews, any discipline, complaints and investigations relating to an officer. So those include both citizen and administrative complaints. So anything that would just constitute an unwarranted invasion of privacy. Next slide, please. And so what I mentioned the 2 evidence codes, right? What's the process? It's usually called a Pitchess hearing. And this came out of a case in 1974. Pitchess I believe, was the sheriff of LA County at the time. And it was, in that case, the defendant was charged with battery of 4 deputy sheriffs. And to support it, he claimed, obviously, he was acting in self-defense and he wanted to look at the personnel files for these officers if they had a propensity of excessive force violence in there. The judge in that case kind of outlined the procedure, that he laid a factual scenario of what happened to him, that, hey, I wasn't the aggressor, I was being attacked here, self-defense. I want to see if there's any people who've previously complained about this officers. I want their contact information so my lawyer can contact them and find out what transpired. And so when my lawyer is cross-examining these officers, he could bring up those incidences, right? So that's what the purpose of that is. So that's what the judge kind of laid the foundation of. What would happen is, and I'll get into that in a second, is when you have a Pitchess hearing, the defense are able to discover this material. And I'll get into how that looks in the next slide. So next slide, Sam? So what is Pitchess is this, that here's let's go to the bottom of the slide. The defendant must allege a factual scenario of misconduct and the defense and a link between the misconduct and defense. So let's take the previous issue, right? That I was not the aggressor. These 4 deputy sheriffs were. They started hitting me. And if I'm being charged on batting an officer, it's a link to defense. If I could show that I was not the aggressor, they were the ones attacking me. So what would happen is a lawyer would write an affidavit and provide what would happen, what I just kind of described. It's a very low bar to meet. I mean, many times, sometimes lawyers don't put any factual scenario, and that's essential. You just can't say, hey, I want to see these files because I believe the officer lied. Well, what happened? You have to give some factual scenario in order to give due process to the officer to defend and counter that from the judge. But again, it's a low bar. Usually the judge will say, hey, you give me something, I'll accept the defendant of the word, and let's go back in camera. What does that mean? So if the judge rules in favor and grants the Pitchess motion, you go back in camera in the judge's chamber, and all that's allowed in the judge's chambers is the court reporter to take notes of the judge, what the judge and everyone in there says, the lawyer for the police department, and the custodian of records, usually the internal affairs sergeant, who has the officer's files. The judge then starts looking over and reading the personnel file. And so in this case, if the lawyer is saying, I just want to see issues of excessive force, the judge will be looking for matters of excessive force, right? And to see if there's any history of that. The judge is not going to release any other things that are not asked for, only what's requested. Sometimes you have a hybrid, what's called a Brady motion too, asking for exculpatory material, but a lawyer usually has to put that in their motion. And so the judge will be looking for excessive force. During those in-camera proceedings, the lawyer can argue still why that record may meet the threshold or not. So let's say we're looking at excessive force, and in this case, it's excessive force. Let's say we're looking at an act of for dishonesty, and instead the officer did something irresponsible, came late 20 times in a row, right? And the judge was ready to turn that over. You could argue, look, that's not an act of dishonesty. That's just being late every day. The officer owned up to being late every day. So those issues shouldn't be turned over, something like that. So it has to be, so there's ability for at least the agency's lawyer to even argue for the release in camera in that. And then the record's sealed. So it's because of the privacy and because court records are generally public, in order to maintain at least the privacy of the officer's personnel records. Those transcripts that occur in that in-camera hearing are sealed and cannot be opened without a court order. And so that's generally the process of it. It's balancing the officer's privacy rights with, as I mentioned, the defendant's right to have knowledge to mount a proper defense if warranted in terms of what actually occurred. Next slide, please. So here, Commissioner Rodriguez, I want to get to your answer to your question, right? Pitches is not recognized in federal court. So if you have a civil lawsuit, if the other side asks for the records, they get it. They don't have to go through the pitches motion. In 2021, there's a case that came out, Towner versus County of Ventura, that there must be a pitches motion in order to get records. In that case, it was a district attorney investigating the district attorney's office. They were designated as a peace officer, so it was required to get a pitches hearing. He was terminated, and he was asking for a civil service hearing. Prior to that, the county wanted to file a writ, and they included some documents in his personnel record, including a notice of intent documents, etc. The officer's attorney claimed that the county violated pitches, that court records are public and they would be seen by public, and the only ways to present these documents is through filing a pitches motion. The only way anyone can get these documents is through a pitches motion. So that brings up an interesting question. Pitches hearings can also be held in a civil service hearing. I'll explain how that's done. That case came down in 2013. Where a court said that if an officer, is facing termination, they can ask for a pitches hearing. How does that play out? It sounds very strange. Here's an example. Let's say a female officer is being terminated for some violation, and she's saying that she's facing either disparate impact or disparate treatment because she knows 7 or 8 male officers did the same thing previously, and they only gotten written reprimands or maybe suspension. So because she's female, it's her first time, she's being punished unfairly. It's excessive punishment, and it's not fair. They could have a pitches hearing in front of the civil hearing officer and ask for disclosure of those documents so she can mount a defense in a civil hearing. But she needs to go through the pitches process. The issue, as I mentioned, the case, and to answer your question, quickly, thank you, the slide back is pitches required for a review board to see the personnel, to see, as you said, Commissioner Rodriguez had asked, previous misconduct or instances of misconduct? The way Cammie and I have been looking at that question, because after this case came down and preparing for my presentation for this commission, is some commissions like Oakland and San Diego do allow it, and it's put in there. San Diego has done it through their charter, right, and given the commission these powers. So if it's to be done, and this is something this issue is something I want to report back to the commission on, as I do some work with Cammie on this. If it's to be done, I believe it needs to be explicitly provided in whatever ordinance, rules, charter that must be provided. For example, the civil service does obviously see a person's personnel file. They see previous incidences. And why is that important? Obviously, that's what, a person can be, let's say, terminated for either a serious act, or it could be part of progressive discipline. Maybe this one isolated incident doesn't warrant a termination, but this is your 4th or 5th time doing this, and the totality of it does warrant that, right? So that's why the commission would see previous, the Civil Service Commission does. So Cammie, I don't know, we talked before about, I know you've helped me on looking at some other cities like Oakland and San Diego. In the past, in doing research on civilian reviews, a lot of times I haven't seen the commissions see personnel files, only investigation files, but it seems like Oakland and San Diego do allow for it. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that point too.
No, when we were doing the research, I was surprised because there are a lot of review boards who don't get anything but the complete investigation file, but there are definitely some, and I'm sure research would find more of those that do have access to the complete personnel files. What I'm looking for is the understanding of how they've been able to do that. So I think there is some more research to be done so we have a clear understanding of what that looks like.
Thank you. And that's kind of where I'm at in terms of, at least with the city of Towner and how this is, the records were disclosed to a court. And my thought is, just like we do with the civil service, the records here are still disclosed within the city agency. The Civil Service Commission is a city agency. So, for example, if I need to see an officer's personal records, there's no requirement that I have to file a pitches. I am part of the city. We're the custodian of these records. So, at least that's how I interpret this case. But like I said, this is something probably I'll report back in my final presentation. I'll start off with this topic just to finalize that. But it's an interesting point, Commissioner Rodriguez, that you brought up. But my belief is that if it's within the specific rules of the commission, they'd be entitled to seeing these previous records through the personnel file. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a question on that, just
Sure.
just as a safeguard, because I think that's an important component of an oversight, is to be able to see past behavior, past pattern. And so just as a safety precaution, would it be kind of act as an umbrella if the commission made a recommendation to allow for pitches, I don't know, to kind of add that clause in so that it's possible that the commission can have that, or the oversight body can have that authority.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe a side question is, would that oversight body also be considered a city entity so that it didn't even need to apply for that pitches?
Sure, Chair Escobedo, Commissioner Rodriguez. Generally, that would be some of the provisions entitled to all access of records. There's a strong. Here's the interesting thing. There's a strong counterpoint, though, to that. At least, I was playing devil's advocate into this point, right? I can see why a Civil Service Commission would want to see previous records, because they're in charge of the issue of discipline, right? And so it's important to see what is an officer's past behavior. Has this been the first violation, right? Is there propensity issues here? Because as I mentioned, the point of progressive discipline. If you do an investigatory body, they aren't the ones issuing discipline. So a counter argument, just to be made aware of, that you may face is the focus is on the immediate investigation, right? In terms of, did this officer commit a policy violation at this point, at this juncture? Where is the relevance? I could easily come up with some points too that is relevance. Where is the relevance of past pattern and practice? Does it create a bias if a commission knows of it? Or the alternative, or does it help? You know what? There is a propensity. I'm sure that leads to it. So there are fine counterpoints. It was just an interesting point I wanted to raise to it. I think, at least the way that some of the cities have done it, they've simply provided that they're entitled to all access and records. And of course, any commission or board that's created out of this process would be considered an entity of the city.
The way that I'm interpreting that is that we probably should have discussion around this.
In the future, sure, absolutely. It's a very interesting issue, and really can't be put down to one slide. As I was putting this together and realized this case out there, and how to address that, because it is a very interesting issue. And looking at what other commissions have done, right? I think it's one that definitely involves even further discussion on it, for sure. Now I'm going into the final portion. I probably went over 25 minutes, so I apologize to the commission. The Brown Act. And so this is what governed us today here, are the open meetings laws and it's found in the government code sections, as I put up on the screen there, 54950 to 5496663. And the premise behind the Brown Act is strong public policy in terms of open government, not having backroom dealings. So it condemns conducting government in secret. Any type of civilian review board would be a Brown Act board, would be required to follow all the provisions of the Brown Act, just like we are here as well. Next slide, please. So just wanted to give an idea to the commission that Why whatever you recommend would be considered a legislative body? It's pretty broad. It means the governing board, commission, directors of a body of a local agency, or any board, commission thereof. So essentially, anything you create based on what's defined under the Brown Act would be a Brown Act body, Brown Act commission. Next slide, please. Now, most everything is held in open. There are some exceptions that are closed session, discussing litigation settlements, whether to take a litigation settlement or not. Certain real estate dealings. Well, one of the important things is, for our purposes here to be aware of, is holding closed sessions to consider the employment, evaluation of performance, discipline, or dismissal of a public employee, or to hear complaints or charges against that employee. So an example, Civil Service Commission, that hearing is open in public, but when they deliberate what to do, that is held in closed session, and they come out and make an announcement, usually a written decision with findings after that. But that deliberation process is all held in closed session. Next slide, please. So for our purposes, what does that mean? San Diego, for example, when they hear a investigator and their report and going over all the evidence, that's held in closed session. So as you see in the bottom slide, public may also exclude the public for examination of witnesses or any other witnesses in the matter being investigated by the legislative body. So a lot of times you will see on a lot of commissions, investigators present to a commission, do that in closed session, but the results, the findings of what we're done must be announced to the public. So just wanted to let the commission know that. Final slide. One more before the final slide. So just the idea of who may attend closed session. So it's all the members of the commission and needed staff that should be there. And again, as I mentioned, once that's done, the Board of Commission must convene back in open session. So usually in a case where you have a report by an investigator, after that, the commission convenes in open session and gives their findings to the decision. And then now the final slide. Just wanted to make the commission know an interesting Attorney General opinion. Now, Attorney General opinions are important. A lot of times cities will ask the Attorney General a legal question and they provide an answer. They're persuasive. And so usually in terms of authorities, obviously legal decisions or legal cases are number one on the list. But then you look at secondary sources. An Attorney General opinion would be considered a secondary source that you can cite in a case and try to use it as persuasive authority. And so there was an issue in 1978 that talks about the Brown Act not permitting any board to go in executive session to hear reports and issue instructions to the chief police regarding the conduct of confidential police investigations. So what does this mean? If the commission wants to talk about in generalities, how investigations are to be done, or giving input or opinion, or if we're doing an audit model and wanting to go, that all has to be done in open session. You can't have a one-on-one chat with police chief. The public needs to know that information, and it should be done. However, as I mentioned, what can be done in private is when you start dealing with an individual and getting that information and deliberations on that. That needs to be held in closed session. So I just wanted to make a clarifying point on that. What could be held in open, or what must be held in open, and what can be held in closed session. And I think with that is my final slide, and I'm either open to questions, we can take a break, or I can answer them now, whatever the chair and the commission would like.
Are there any questions for Mr. Doimus before we open up public comment? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Doimus, for the presentation. And I'm sure that if during our discussions we have questions related to this, we'll be able to ask you during our discussion.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Sam, is there anyone here for public comment?
Give me 1 second. If there's anyone in the audience that would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand in the chat feature. There are no hands raised, Mr. Chair, no public comment.
Thank you. So with that, we'll close out public comment and we will go on a brief recess. How does 7:50 sound to everyone? About 15 minutes? All
Thank you.
right. So we're in recess until 7:50.
Oh.
And for the commission, please mute yourself if you're not already muted. Okay, Cami, I will make you a presenter now. Does that work for you?
Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect.
That's a town made you presenter. Let me know if that worked for you.
Yeah, we're good. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, we will call the meeting back to order at 7:50. And before turning it over to Cami, I'm going to read the item into the record. It is the discussion on review board authorities and procedures. NACO will facilitate a discussion with the Community Formation Commission on the authorities and procedures of the review board in the hybrid oversight model. The CFC may potentially take action on the authorities and procedures of the review board in the hybrid oversight model. And I'll turn it over to you, Cami.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of things before I get started. I wanted to first kind of just mention the fact that I think that although the progress may seem very slow at this point, I think you guys are doing an amazing job of information gathering and getting the type of pieces of information that you need to move forward with making some very important decisions. So from some of the conversations I've had, I know that the slow going nature of this is not necessarily what all of you had hoped for. It seems like many of you are people who want things to happen and happen sooner rather than later. But I will say that this is a really involved process and a huge learning curve. There aren't a whole lot of people out there who are experts in civilian oversight mechanisms. And so I applaud you for taking the time to find out all of the information that you feel you need to know. So thank you for doing that. I also wanted to talk to you about the process that I was envisioning for this evening and moving forward as we begin to talk about the specific pieces of the different mechanisms included in the hybrid model that you all are looking at. Tonight, we're going to look specifically at things that are specific to the review board. I would like this to be a conversation. We're going to talk about 4 different areas. That's going to be purpose, composition, training, and powers and duties. I'm going to give some examples. I feel like all of you have enough information at this point to at least start expressing some thoughts on the types of things you're interested in seeing in this board. The process I'm talking about is hearing from you, taking notes, and then putting those notes into maybe a more coherent form to then send back to you so that at our next meeting, we can look at those and narrow them down. There is no way 2 hours plus into the meeting that we probably will be able to have very definitive answers by the end of this of what the review board piece will look like. But I think we can make a lot of progress because I don't think any of you have really had the chance to start to verbalize what this could look like. To this point, it's mostly, I feel like it's me doing a lot of talking instead of all of the possibilities. So if all of you are comfortable with that and don't have any questions before we begin, I would like to just kind of jump into that first piece, the purpose. Okay, and actually that was a lie. Before we jump into the purpose, I'm sorry, I'm gonna talk at you for just one more minute. I included a slide in here that talks just kind of a reminder about the review focused model. And I can send particularly this slide out to all of you when I send out the notes, so you can have this in the back of your mind as you're reviewing those. You know, as some of the basics, civilian review models are a way that we ensure that community has an ability to provide input into the process. And that community involvement often adds public trust to the process, typically takes the forms of volunteer boards or commissioners. In some instances, Those types of boards are, there are certain seats allotted to certain representatives from the local community groups. So one of the things that we'll talk about when we get to composition is how do you ensure that you have a broad range of representation from all members of your community. Some of the ranges of authority for the review model, and definitely this is not an all-inclusive list. So some of the things are receiving complaints, forwarding them to law enforcement agencies for investigation, reviewing those complaints, in some cases remanding those cases back to the department for further investigation or clarification. In some cases, recommending a disposition, and that's something that we can talk a little bit more about what that term disposition means. In many cases, when an investigation is reviewed by a review board, they receive the investigation with a disposition on it, whether or not it's sustained, unfounded, not sustained. So there's a range of different dispositions that can be put on those cases. In some jurisdictions, hearing complaints or hearing appeals from complainants or subject officers if they don't agree with the disposition of a case. And then also holding public forums, doing community outreach, whether that's by the staff of that staffs the oversight agency or review board members or commissioners themselves. And then holding meetings in public accordance with the state laws and union contracts. So that last piece is really actually doing all of the work in accordance with state laws and anything that union contracts might bind them to. Some considerations as we move forward, you know, like I mentioned before, one of the great strengths of the review piece is the ability to involve the community. It also tends to make the broader community feel like there's a higher level of transparency. And more police departments, what we see is that police departments seem more likely to take action on things when recommendations are made publicly. So if you put everything out there in the open, the transparency that we've talked about earlier this evening, and I think in every other meeting that we've had, is really one of the strengths of this. Some of the challenges with the review piece is that sometimes it can be lack independence. A lot of that has to do with how board members are appointed. There are also issues that, and I think all of you will very much appreciate this, all volunteer boards have limits. They all have lives outside of that board. They have other jobs, in some cases more than one job. And so it is, it can be limiting to the amount of work that they can actually do. And that also goes along with time commitment and the ability for things like childcare. If you're trying to get all members of the community to be able to be a part of this board, how do you ensure that all of them are able? And then also there is a large learning curve. There's a lot of training that needs to be done so that the volunteer board members that you're putting into place actually have the information they need to carry out the mandate they've been given. So just wanted to very quickly go over those again so you had a base of information, and I will absolutely send this slide out via SAM, and hopefully if you decide you'd like to put this on the page, then we can also have it translated on your webpage. So now I'd like to get into the next piece. So first, I want to give you a couple of examples of how other oversight agencies have handled purpose. And we talked a little bit about some of these at our last meeting, but I just want to throw some of these out. In some cases, the purpose that's given in an ordinance is very broad, such as these first two. Just one city says to ensure that law enforcement responds to the needs and concerns of all the community to help build trust. Another example is to develop the public trust, legitimacy, and cooperation necessary to improve police-community relations and enhance public safety. Those almost sound like mission statements, if you will. There are other examples where they're a little bit broader, like this one where they've added, impartial and fair investigation of complaints. Then this one is specific to Berkeley. But then we also have cities where they list out very specific items, such as providing additional perspective to police misconduct, encourage civilians to take part in the process, to reach independent determinations that are supported by evidence and based on a preponderance of evidence, to identify patterns of alleged police misconduct, and to make policy recommendations. And in some cases, we also see things like to review data, to make sure that data is accessible to the public. There are also things like that. So my hope is that I would like to hear from all of you what you feel the purpose of this should be. And I'm asking you this not to give me a perfectly crafted purpose. What I'm really asking for is really more of a brainstorming session of the things that come to your mind that are important as far as purpose is concerned. And I will say, I just want to say, I can't see any of you because I can only see my slides. So just jump in.
Well, I would like to start just by saying, starting with the very bottom piece, to make policy and training recommendations is definitely something that I see is extremely important, and to review data. Yeah, and to make, yeah.
Okay.
That's where I'd like.
Thank you, Louisa.
Mary, you're muted.
Yeah,
Mary, you're muted.
Purpose, you're not looking for purpose, like what's going to be at the top of the ordinance or something like that, but like with a small p, just the various functions of it?
No, what I'm
actions and some, yeah.
I'm talking about, so what I'm talking about is really what's at the top. In some cases, people are very specific and they go into some functions like making policy recommendations, and some are much more broad, more mission focused. So I think because we don't know how the group as a whole will feel about whether it's one or the other, I think throwing out what comes to mind when we're talking about purpose is important. I will say one of the last things that we're going to talk about when we talk about review, the review board functions, is going to be that last piece of powers and duties, almost like the authorities or jurisdiction. And so I think that it's important. There may be some repeats in those two categories.
Okay.
So I would just like to say, in terms of the policy and training recommendation that I just said, I'm sort of thinking about putting this, putting everything in there and then maybe shaping it down to something smaller. It could be, I'm not in the position of should it be broad or should it be a small statement at this point. I just feel that that's an
Understood.
I think the third one you have, the promoting public trust through independent oversight. I know for myself that's a big, I see that as a big priority. I think increasing the communication between the public and the police department and people on the commission. It's important.
Yeah, similar to that. I'm going to echo that and then pull out a couple more pieces that stood out to me. The encouraging civilians to take part in the process. And then I guess the second one, like developing the public trust. I mean, those are both very broad, encourage and develop. But, I really feel like that's what this commission was the first steps to, was like getting participation from a broad representation of the community. And I would love to see that really be like, embedded into the description of what the eventual oversight body would be, because I think, that's the lack of trust seems to be where all of the stumbling blocks are going to be, right? Like if this commission just becomes yet another civic entity that doesn't maintain, really good communication with the community and really good processes for continuing to receive feedback, just like we have. Yeah.
So along that line, I think I can hear where it would be frustrating for parts of the community who have been historically marginalized or targeted by law enforcement to increase community trust with police. So I think maybe if we can rephrase it to something like an oversight commission is to help foster or strengthen relationships between police and community so that trust can be developed or strengthened. Something like that. So we're seeing it from both ends. We're seeing it from law enforcement entity or SVPD in particular, whether it's through transparency or policy change or whatever, adopts certain changes so that the community can trust them. And then in return, the community will see certain changes so that they develop trust, as opposed to just placing the responsibility on community to start trusting law enforcement. And so, since I'm talking, one of the ways one of the purposes I think for us would be to investigate all or most excessive use of force or any excessive use of force reports and any reports that have to do with discrimination of some sort.
So are you talking about the oversight body or the auditor monitor, or the overall, I guess?
I guess overall, yeah.
I mean, I guess we can sort that out some other time.
Can I also add too, because I think this was on a previous slide, I was looking for it to reference here, but the previous slide, I think in the review functions, it was the body itself can receive complaints from the community. And I feel like, yeah, like that really connects to sort of the purpose that I was trying to articulate, just because I think there will always be community members who will not trust the police despite efforts to develop and foster that trust. And I think having an independent body that can actually be a recipient of feedback and official complaints and then pass that along provides a really, contingency for the fact that the trust is going to be really hard to build for a lot of parts of the community.
And I hope this goes without saying, if I, as I'm typing, misrepresent anything that you have said, please just let me know. Anyone else?
I think to follow up on Rachel's point, I would like the review board to have the ability to file third-party complaints for the reason that if someone doesn't feel comfortable and even accepting anonymous complaints, I think that's something I would be interested in. Especially for undocumented folks in our community, that could be very big.
So Cami, I'm assuming you're going to sort out sort of the powers and duties, I mean, because we're kind of, I guess, just brainstorming. Right.
Yes, absolutely. We will, after this meeting, when I kind of put it into what will become kind of a draft document for you all to just start pulling apart and adding to, I'll try and recategorize them a little bit, but particularly once you decide if you want a very broad purpose, a specific purpose, we can sort that all out.
Just help seeing it in black and white, and that may help us ultimately, probably not tonight, but at some point narrow that. But I think one thing I may be here somewhere, but it does talk about policy and training recommendations, but really ongoing evaluation of not only the local department training, but the post training. So just being able to, on a regular basis, being able to monitor and offer input, into that.
Great, thank you, Mary.
I wanted to add something on, I don't know how to word this, but transparency and reporting mechanism, like as Commissioner Alonso brought up about different police reporting systems that we've seen and that haven't been responsive because of any X, Y, or Z reasons. I'd love for this commission to have consistent, reliable public transparency and reporting of whatever criteria we come up with that is always available and updated.
Great, thank you, Richard.
I think one piece that kind of sticks out to me is just to identify patterns. It goes on to say of alleged police misconduct, but I feel like just identifying patterns as part of the reviewing of data or evaluated practices or anything like that is an important piece.
And I know we've also brought up this before, but just to capture it here, maybe have some, responsibility to continue ongoing community surveys, or right, like beyond investigating reports and things like that, but kind of continue some of the tasks that we've assigned ourselves for regular self-evaluation of the oversight body and the process and the community's kind of climate. I guess the climate survey is what we kind of thought the eventual oversight body might do.
Okay. These are all great. Anything else coming to mind?
Something that, and Louisa, you might remember better, way back in our first group of committee we were on, where we talked about a desire to be familiar with or offer input into how the department responds to crises within itself. So for instance, is there, after incident briefings or mental health, opportunities, so that, in other words, so that whatever stress reactions build up and can sometimes manifest in negative impact on the community. So I don't know how you frame that.
Okay. Would it be fair to say internal and external crisis?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, crisis intervention, yeah.
Great. Anyone else want to add to this? And let me say, if something comes to you later, this is not the last time you get to contribute to this list.
Well, my question is, and I agree with, you know, the transparency and like overall we're saying just holding more accountability to the police department. But my question is, with all this data and evaluation and the transparency among that, where is the power in which to make that policy change or weigh in these policies and, you know, provide that feedback?
So it would be part of the authorities given to it, the ability to make those recommendations based on the data that's being reviewed. And eventually, when we get into kind of the nitty gritty of it, there are ways that you can lay out exactly what that looks like. So
Okay.
for instance, in some communities, there is the ability to, well, when we talk about the monitor piece, the types of things they're able to do with the data. But also then the review board makes a recommendation, and then you lay out what happens next. How is that received? Is there a response that's required? What's the time frame? So there's all of kind of a process that can be part of the final recommendation. But I think that I think that's one of those things that once we start having the draft, we can start getting more and more detailed once we have our major points.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely. Okay. Anything else before we move on?
I think that looks good.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is composition. We're talking about composition of the board. What is it going to look like? And so some of the things to consider as we're going through our next brainstorming list is, you know, numbers of members. You know, do you want 9 members? Do you want 11 members? And also to kind of think about why would you want more or less? And do you need alternates? That's another thing that many cities think about. Who is the appointing authority? How will the board reflect the community? How will you outline, in other words, how will you outline in the recommendation what steps will be taken to make this board look as you as a community formation commission feel it should look? Another consideration that many commissions or task force have to deal with is sworn law enforcement included in any capacity of the review board. What are their residency requirements? Are there age restrictions? You know, there are many cities that make a push to include youth, but what's your definition of youth? Is it 18 and over? Is it 16 and over? Is it, you know, so those are things that you need to think about. There are some boards that reserve a spot on the board for someone who is under the age of, so you can have a youth perspective. So there are things like that to consider. I think I would also, in this conversation, talk about stipends. If you feel stipends are important, because of we talked a little earlier about if you want this to be a representative board, what things do you put in place to make sure that any member of your community could actually participate if they so chose. And then, you know, many cities work very hard to consider board composition that's broadly inclusive. There are examples where, and I just feel like I have to tell you some of the pitfalls that we have in this conversation. There are some that are so specific that sometimes they have vacancies for long periods of time because they can't find someone who wants to fill that position that checks all the boxes of the ordinance for that particular vacancy. There are also, some that are so specific that they've been accused of implementing quotas.
Right.
So there are things like that, and then also, and I apologize if we had this conversation in the last meeting already, but you also, if you make it so specific, you run the risk of excluding someone.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those are things to consider. And I will say that this is a really important piece, because one of the reasons you have the review board is so that it can be inclusive of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so what your recommendations on what it will look like this is a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
No pressure.
Tammy, I have a question because I remember you saying this last time that broad is maybe better because when we get so specific for all the reasons that you listed, how do we navigate that with language? Do you have language that other communities have used that speak to wanting diversity yet not being so specific that we limit ourselves?
As a matter of fact, I do. I just happen to have that right here. So one of the ways that we've seen a particular city deal with it is this. The board shall be broadly inclusive and reflective of race, ethnicity, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, economic status, neighborhoods, and various communities of interest in the city. I mean, that is just like an umbrella covering just about everything without being so specific about different ethnicities or races within the community.
I like that. I also like how the city qualified folks for this commission right here, and I'll read it. Either personal or professional experience or both that will garner the confidence and trust of the Santa Barbara community, including relevant lived experience, demonstrated community standing, and relevant academic research or professional experience. So what they didn't do in the printed version of the qualifications is talk about the diversity, but I like the part of garnering confidence and trust in the Santa Barbara community, and not limiting it to professional experience, so lived experience and academic experience as well. So I think both of those descriptions have a nice combination of specifics and also like vagueness or openness.
Yeah,
Okay,
I totally agree. I think lived experience is something, I mean, right, we also have to, you can't discriminate based on gender or race, so, at least those two categories. So I think, lived experience with populations disproportionately impacted by policing, all of that gets to ensuring, that people of color and other disproportionately affected populations will be there. I also really liked from our selection process, the city council, I mean, if they are the appointing authority, they also said they would take into consideration letters of recommendation or nomination from organizations, right? So if there's a process for kind of also taking into account like letters from community organizations or other entities for that. Yeah, because that was I think that was specifically called out in the formation of this group.
Cameron, I had a question for you. This is Davo. Did you notice any pitfalls regarding having foreign law enforcement on the commission? Are there any good points or positives and negatives to that? Because I think that's something to consider. I think I see some upside, but I just didn't know if there was any conflicts of interest that ever arose based on your experience of observing those.
So what So I think the best way to answer that is to give some examples of how it has worked when it has been included, and also give some examples of why other communities have not included it. So in those communities who have included, and in fact, when I served on the Civilian Review Board in Indianapolis, we had 2 ex officio sworn law enforcement on the board. And and one of the benefits of that was that they were there to give, one of them was from internal affairs. So we're reviewing an internal affairs case. There's someone there to answer questions directly, real time. In some other cities, they have liaisons appointed to the board rather than someone who is a member of the board. Who, Cedar Rapids is an example of this, where they can, the ordinance doesn't specify whether, you know, are they brought in when asked, if they sit in the room, that's up to the board really, to determine in their operating procedures, but they have liaisons assigned to assist with questions. Some of the reasons that people do not want law enforcement as part of the board include the fact that there are many people in the community that may feel stifled in conversation because of, if you have someone with lived experience with disproportionate policing and you're asking them to sit on a board at the table with law enforcement, that could be very intimidating to them. It could make them not feel like they can actually speak their mind or vote the way that they feel they should. So that is one of the main reasons. And the other is that there are many people in the community outside of the board itself who see that as as biased. If you have law enforcement involved in the process, then how are you able to have an unbiased process itself? Now, I say all of that hopefully without, I would like to present that information in an unbiased manner as well, because I feel like that's for you all to decide what is best for your community. But I can say that there are communities that have done it both ways and feel very comfortable in the way that they have chosen. Now, did the community members in Cedar Rapids all want that to have happen where they had liaisons? Absolutely not. That was a compromise that occurred. And they're just starting, and we'll see how it works for them. Indianapolis has had officers on their board since 1998. So.
I think that's a really important conversation that we should have, but can I just back up a little bit and ask for you to can you write down or type out the example that you shared with us of the sort of broad diversity requirement?
Okay.
While Cami is typing that, I would also propose that we tackle one of the less controversial ones on here, which is residency requirements. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, but I don't think anyone here, or I hope most of you would agree with me that nobody should be on the board that's not under the jurisdiction of the Santa Barbara Police Department. So living in the city or in
that wasn't a
areas
requirement for this commission. Just
I don't live in the city, so.
I live in Nolita, so I actually, yeah. So just, yeah, the formation of this commission did not have that residency requirement.
Right. I believe that, especially on the south coast of Cal, so similarly, all of the people that have encounters with the police are not necessarily residents of the city of Santa Barbara.
I I mean, I work with the police all the time, and I live in Galita, so I'm not
So
sure
on
that
some
that
of the-
is necessarily.
Yeah, on some of the commissions and board requirements, it says to reside in the city of or work in the city of. And I think that would be fair.
I would agree that that would be fair.
I also think there's examples in the city of commissions and boards where there are 1 or 2 positions that are, fill some other kind of role. So for instance, say with architectural board of review, 1 who's a civilian that's not a professional or something like that. Just to throw out there that, and I don't think we need to decide all that tonight, but that there's a lot of already options and examples of the city kind of having a broad palette. I do think that the one thing that I would agree is that for us not to be too exclusive and specific, because I do think that often has a result of leaving vacancies and also or leaving out people who would otherwise be good commissioners. Some of the commissions in the city that have very specific requirements are pretty much vacant all the time. The living wage committee, so.
So, for the sake of this continuing to be a brainstorming session,
right?
Since we've had 2 opinions expressed, resident of the city versus work or live in the city, if all of you don't mind, I'd like to include both of those on this list at this point, because I feel like once you have more things in the mix and have a little bit more time to think about it, then you can make that actual decision.
That's great.
Well, I think that's really important for all of this, because from my perspective, we're not voting on these things right now as like final decisions. It's just getting it out there.
And
hopefully when we do, we'll have it be the only thing on the agenda.
So on that note of balancing out perspectives, in regards to letters of recommendation, I know it definitely could be good, but I also think about like say a single mom who hasn't really been involved in a lot of things because she has other things in her mind. She may not have community connections, but may still be a good candidate to be on a board. So just want to kind of think about maybe not including that, because it may just count some people out who don't have community connections. And one other thing, I really liked the description that mentions all like the age, race, gender identity, and I would love to add ability in that.
Okay. Absolutely.
Thank you, Kim.
Absolutely.
On the residency conversation, something that I just want us to be aware of is that I work with a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness, and I think that it's a group of folks that are disproportionately affected by policing oftentimes. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about is their inability to access, I mean, this is any number of things, but complaint forms or things like that. And I think like having a voice from that group could be really important on a board like this. But I think that creates its own set of complications that I would just like us to be aware of.
Richard, would you feel comfortable with me adding to that those experiencing or having had experienced?
Yes, we often say lived experience of homelessness.
Okay.
So adding to that, I'm wondering if so what we talked about was folks that live in the Santa Barbara city versus outside of the city. So and Rich, help me understand if this will be inclusive or exclusive to folks with lived experience on the streets. Can we say live within the city, within the county of Santa Barbara, so that it's at least, you know, in this jurisdiction as opposed to out of state or, you know, in Anaheim?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the county is very inclusive. I just also think that there's a lot of folks that live in their car that are part of people who are being over policed as well. And so I think like doing something like that that includes them would be great. That's all. Jordan, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no worries. I would love to at least have youth encouraged in some way. I know that we just said age, but if we can have youth encouraged, that would be great. I think the appointing authority would need to be the city council, I would presume. I think that one's makes sense to me. Unsure if the appointees need to be by districts as well. I don't know if that makes sense, so that there's an even swath, or if they're by higher police neighborhoods. Looking at that data could be interesting, but something that could be added to the brainstorm. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, number of members, I've been on boards with 20 people. That's a lot. I would hope that we wouldn't go any more than that, or focus on an odd number so that there isn't any ties or anything like that.
I would suggest between 9 and 13. I think when you get too far past 13, assuming at some point people will be meeting in person again, maybe it's a little easier, but. And probably a couple of alternates as a couple of those as alternates, or.
I would say from experience being on this board that I would like to see alternates to give people an opportunity to be involved.
If we
From experience with the Fire and Police Commission, we've had you know, an absent seat. We've had an empty seat for a couple years because there wasn't an alternate. So it would be, I support that.
How many are on the Police and Fire Commission?
There's only 5. So I can say that it's a very different meeting experience, meeting with 4 or 5 people versus, you know, 14. These meetings seem very, very long because we want every voice to be, you know, to contribute. So when we're looking at decision-making meetings, I think we want to consider the impact of a large commission.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that to this part of the conversation. They've just done studies that show the more people that are involved in decision making, the less likely there's a decision to be made. So are we of the opinion that like a 5 to 7 person board is too few? Like, does that limit us in our ability to fulfill the representation requirements, the inclusivity requirements, or would that be sufficient, taking into consideration like the effectiveness of the commission?
5 might be too small.
Yeah, 5 is really
I feel
small.
like 5 is too small.
The smallest would be 7 with an alternate.
7.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in and yeah, I feel like I want to, at least in this phase, if this is where the argument's going, like I'll argue for the larger number. I mean, a small number is exclusive, and statistics like the more people involved, the less likely a decision is to be made is kind of, I mean, that's absolutely exclusive, right? Like that says that we're not interested in a process that's truly collaborative or truly representative of lots of different voices. And I mean, this commission, this is a good number, and we've done a lot of work in working groups. And if this oversight commission is going to do more things like that, like they'll have staff support just like we've had, but right, I mean, we've all done a lot of work, and there's what, 15 of us is what we started with. So I mean, I don't know, like achieving diversity and then also building into this a process that really listens to a broad, you know, array of voices. I don't know, it just makes me really uncomfortable to hear like we just got to make sure that decisions can be made fast, because that doesn't seem to really match with the values of this process either.
Yeah.
I would also like to say that I would be a very strong proponent of giving stipends for this position. You guys get into it.
Yes.
I support that.
Yes, please, please.
Maybe I should change should to must. Sorry, there you go.
If I may, oh, go ahead, Kim.
I was just gonna go back and ask Jordan, regarding the youth, did you have thoughts on what age range that includes?
High school, unclear of how low that should go. Because at any point in time, a youth can be policed. So that is something that I think we need to discuss. But I would hope at the very least high school age.
Cool, makes sense, thanks.
Jordan, what do you think of having like one position designated youth position?
That'd be great, at least one, but like I wouldn't limit it. Like if more youth want to be involved, great.
I know we have youth boards and commissions at the city already. Are there considerations for the inclusion of minors on such things?
Good question.
Is that a Sam question? Or?
Maybe that would be something Mr. Doimus or others would give us more clarity on. If you can't come to a meeting because you have homework.
Well, you know, we do have youth councils or boards that are strictly youth members. We don't have a mix of other commissions where we have people under the age of 18. So that would be a rarity. That would be a first. Obviously, some of the commissions, you know, the recommendation to consider. You know, there's some points that should be also, you know, discussed in terms of when you're bringing in the POA to have discussions with them, everything else. You know, how does it feel, for example, if you're going to give access to personnel files? You know, a 16-year-old, 15-year-old. And I hate to say something like that, but you know, it's something to consider. Would they take? I know this commission would take concerns on privacy issues and all that. You know, would it be difficult for a 15-year-old? Wow, look what I saw with what's in this officer's file or something else, and telling a friend, and you know, trying to respect the process on that. So, you know, those are just some considerations just to point out and have a discussions on, for sure.
I will say in some of the other commissions that we've had this conversation with, the other side of that too to consider is that some of the information in some of those investigative files can be very graphic and disturbing. And so there is trauma to consider for anyone who serves on a board or works in oversight who has to look at those files and those images over and over again. You might want to, that's something to consider when you're talking about the age range is.
I mean, and then also like, that's something like you said, Cami, that even an adult it can be difficult for. So, I mean, with anybody who we want to be a part of this or who gets chosen to be a part of this, they're coming in with that understanding, you know, and then obviously with the support of others, they'll be able to like step out or step in as they need to, right? But I do feel the youth that would provide a specific, like a unique voice, right? And also I had a question, what if an individual, let's say youth, you know, they're on probation and they want to serve, like would that be something that they would be able to serve, like if they're on probation, or an adult, you know, who's on probation parole and they want to serve in the commission, would they be able to? And then circling back to the residents, I don't know how the board feels of like possibly having like a cap that you have to have like some sort of experience with Santa Barbara, like live here for a certain amount of time or work in the Santa Barbara County for a certain amount of time. Does that make sense, that recommendation? Sorry, my internet's been really bad, so I'm literally in a parking lot right now in this meeting. so hopefully y'all can hear me.
I
We
do
can hear
think
you.
that's
Thank you, Anna.
that's a good point, Anna, is to with the residency, having some either history with or connection to the city of Santa Barbara, whether it's having lived here, having worked here. I mean, I think definitely think that's a valid consideration.
Yeah, but I will say I initially was like, oh, that's a no-brainer. But like, if you live in Goleta, and that doesn't mean that you won't perhaps interact with the Santa Barbara Police Department, right? But I also wonder, like, if we extend it to the county, like, do we want folks from like Lompoc on the on the commission? And I wonder, I'm not saying for others, and I'm sure, you know, the fine citizens of Lompoc would be great, but I just I wonder if that's a consideration.
Maybe south coast of Santa Barbara County.
How do we define that geographically? South of the tunnel?
Geographically, it's the tunnel, yeah, top of 154. But I guess we can throw it in the mix and kind of, you know, see how.
So can you say that again for me, Christian? How you'd like that phrase?
We were talking about possibly living to the south coast of Santa Barbara County, which is really from what we call the tunnel, the Gaviota Tunnel.
Gaviota to Carpenter, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is also one of those sections where we could potentially leave it more broad, right, and just sort of encourage the appointing authority to use their discretion, because I feel like, you know, they're at City College. I mean, we have so many staff and faculty that live in Ventura, right, but they work here. So if it's working in Santa Barbara as a criteria, but maybe, you know, someone who lives in Carp but works in Ventura, then right, like you'd go with the person in Ventura. So yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to just think of ways to leave that maybe a little bit open for the appointing authority to have some leeway as well.
Well, and I think like with this commission, I think the council did a pretty good job of, you know, kind of balancing that geographically. Some of us don't live in the city, but did. And yeah.
It was also a very heightened time for council where they were receiving a lot of attention.
That's for sure.
I was just going to say they were highly motivated, and we're also trying to, yeah, lay groundwork for any number of different councils and what they might look like at that time.
Right. It's a very, yeah. I do. We keep, you know, that we're going to have a different police chief, a different, you know, city administrator, just a lot of different things coming into when this recommendation before them. So
I want to return just briefly to something Anna brought up in terms of folks who may have records, right, or youth on probation or something, because there's also, I think, a different kind of residency requirement as well, which is the, you know, this commission, they specified you know, undocumented. I mean, it's probably unlikely we're going to get people from that population, you know, interested in necessarily being on a civic commission in terms of safety and security and that. But like, right, like I'm not an American citizen. I'm a permanent resident, and that was something that was okay for this commission. But I feel like, you know, that's always something to bring up is, do we have any other kind of requirements? Because I do think Anna's absolutely right. I mean, folks with records who are historically excluded from a lot of different civil service spaces would be really useful, perhaps, on a commission like this.
I do think if people are on active parole or probation, there may be issues with reviewing confidential material. And I just, if they're actively on right now.
Serafina, I know that you wanted to jump in as well.
Thank you. But yeah, no, the point had already been made. I was just going to talk about the residency requirements and just making it more broad, which I think I like either just leaving it up to the discretion of the appointing authority, or just saying like living, working, or, you know, having lived here.
If I can, back to the stipend topic, I personally would like to see a more substantial stipend, particularly providing the opportunity for those that don't make a living wage now to be able to make up for hours that they might have worked at their other job doing this work. And I know the default for the city is the $50 a meeting, and for many people that's prohibitive for them. That wouldn't be enough. So I'd like to see a higher stipend than what the city typically offers, and then also offering childcare, some sort of mechanism for childcare would be huge.
All right. There we go. Cami, I do want to speak to, I forgot the law enforcement participation. I believe that having sworn law enforcement on the body would not be appropriate, probably not even appropriate for them. You know, possibly liaison, but you know, I do think having past law enforcement or investigative experience or expertise can be an asset to reading, you know, to some of these discussions. And so I don't think, but I do think sworn law enforcement probably not appropriate.
I mean, I agree. When I think of essentially being audited, it's an outside entity. And so it would just be really confusing, in my opinion.
How do you
Yeah,
all
I
feel
think ultimately if the goal is like independence from the police, the jurisdiction being reviewed, that it would be inappropriate. Sorry, Lizzie, go ahead.
how do you all feel about a liaison? Maybe not being a voting person, but I don't know. What do you
Like
think
at
about
the
that?
meetings, a resource at the
I
meetings
mean,
or
like,
something?
sort of like what we have now is having access to,
Yeah.
you know, we have access to John Doimus, and
Well, John
I'm not.
John's not sworn, yeah.
No,
I mean,
no,
it'd be
I know,
like
but
if,
I'm just
Lieutenant Hill, we have Lieutenant Hill.
But
Lieutenant Hill.
I would imagine we would have some type of leadership there to, if there's questions that arise, they are a resource. So at some point.
As a
But
resource.
I am also in agreement that having a sworn member on the board would not serve the purpose of the board.
Would seem to be a conflict for them. as well, I would think. But
What about somebody who was retired law enforcement?
I wouldn't exclude them.
Yeah, it feels discriminatory.
We have
We have experience with law enforcement. You can't be on this.
I think that was included in the earlier statement. It's kind of similar to how this board, this commission was formed, because there's a lot of people that have different various experiences.
I think what we'll rely on, I guess, is that the council, you know, they're going to try to balance all of this, you know.
I mean, if they have background in law enforcement, or if they were like a patrol officer or whatever, we should be able to see like what experience they had, or if they had any complaints, or be very transparent with all of that as well. So that way they're coming in like open and honestly, you know, and then we can, or whoever is making the decision can decide like, yes, your experience would be of an, you know, provide the, I don't know how to say it, but like provide a benefit to the commission, you know, or if they had a lot of complaints on their jacket or whatever, then obviously like we would not want that, you know.
Well, and to Commissioner
Returning
Zepeda's
to the, hold on. Go ahead, Christian, and then Rachel.
So I would just say, just to Commissioner Zepeda's point, the South Bend Oversight Commission is currently having a lot of issues because they hired a director. This is like a staff position, so this would be different than the composition of the board, but they hired a staff director who was former law enforcement and who was discovered had several misconduct investigations throughout the course of their career, which has just kind of damaged the reputation out of the gate of the oversight function. And so I think that to Commissioner Zepeda's point, I think that's a reasonable consideration that should be taken.
So a good background investigation, I mean, whether it's for staff or whatever, I think is important. I can't believe that, imagine they do backgrounds there in South Bend, but
personnel files.
Yeah, but that's sort of like you don't know that you need it until you need it, right? And so I think in the interest of being proactive, to your point, Commissioner O'Gorman, I think that would be really appropriate to have some kind of language about like do the background check.
I mean, alternatively, excluding law enforcement, even retired law enforcement, is a way to avoid having to do that at all. And I mean, I think when Anna was speaking, just remembering what we talked about trauma, right? Like who are we putting in a room then with even retired law enforcement or someone, we can certainly make the arguments both ways. And I also just want to say too, I mean, we just spent on a previous slide, spent a lot of time agreeing, for the most part, all of us that spoke to it, that trust is a huge part of the values that we're looking at when we're thinking about these recommendations, and just, not to lose sight of that value of trust when we're looking at, this, because I think the law enforcement, sort of sworn law enforcement participation, in some ways, even as like a liaison, I think access to the data, absolutely important. Like everything Lieutenant Hill has done for us, having access to a Q&A with the chief, that's all been very useful. But I don't know, anything more official or more kind of omnipresent seems like, like that trust is going to be compromised, I think, for a lot of folks in the community.
I couldn't support excluding retired people. I mean, I'm a retired probation officer. Where do you draw the line? There's character involved.
I'm also thinking about, I obviously do not support having a retired law enforcement person with a history of, abuse or whatever However, I'm thinking about what it would look like if we say somebody who is actively on probation or parole can be part of the commission, but without doing a background check on them. But then we're going to do a background or personnel background check on a retired law enforcement person. So I just want us to kind of be careful about that. And I don't know what that might look like, but I want to, because, we also need to get the buy-in of law enforcement and police union. So by saying that we can have, a person with a criminal history, but not a law enforcement, it's going to jeopardize that buy-in.
I can, if I may, offer an example of how, because, I've heard some of you say there's kind of two different lines of thinking here. I will say if there are some who stipulate, those who might include retired law enforcement, sometimes they stipulate a number of years since they've been in law enforcement. Sometimes they stipulate that they cannot have been a member of, in your case, the Santa Barbara Police Department. So you could have someone that worked in another law enforcement agency, or was, worked for a sheriff's department, worked probation, but not for the overseen entity. So whether that's SBPD or the Harbor Patrol or whatever your jurisdiction ends up being. And in some cases, they also exclude any current law enforcement or sworn law enforcement and their family members as well. So, there's kind of several different pieces in there and different directions you could go if you decide to include law enforcement. That might make it so that you don't necessarily feel that you have to. There are some ways to get around what your concerns are. And I can provide one of the things we can do is we can look at language of how other cities have dealt with that very issue. Mm-hmm. Some are very specific and some are a little bit more broad, and I think maybe that would help, since there is a wide range of opinions on this particular.
Yeah, that would.
There always are in this conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, okay. Cammie, have you ever seen where there's a cap on the number of people in that category? So in this, it would be retired law enforcement officers. You could say not to exceed 2 members of the board. Or
I cannot think of a cap off the top of my head, but when I do that research, I'll also look for that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And to Lizzie's point, can you look for examples if we were to ultimately consider people actively on probation or parole, which I wouldn't at this point, but if we do, can you see examples of how there is any kind of screening mechanism there? Are we saying any offense? Just something to consider.
Sorry, my typing is getting worse as the evening goes on.
It's getting.
Is there anything that we haven't considered that is like, because this is a great list on here on the right, but I'm wondering, because it is late and my brain is kind of moving slower, if there's anything that we haven't considered.
So I think that you have a very comprehensive list here. I do think when I send you the notes on this, I will also send you language of how this looks like at the end result in the ordinance language, so you can kind of see, which might spark some ideas of things that we didn't cover. I will say, looking at all of you, now that I can see you again, I feel like since we're past the 3-hour mark, that we should probably, there's 2 other sections here. I think that we can talk about it more. I would like to end this conversation here, do what I promised to do for you, and then we can pick up the conversation at the next meeting, so that you can be fresh. We can, and I can also revisit these, which will also be fantastic.
I agree with that.
Would we require a motion to table this until the next meeting?
We will, but let's open up public comment and then we can take a motion. Sam, is there anyone here from the public that would like to do public comment?
Give me 1 second, Chair. There's no one in attendance, so no public comment.
Thank you.
I feel like I run everyone away by the time I get to the end. I apologize.
We'll start with this item next time. So is there a motion to continue this item to our September 22nd, 2021 meeting?
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
Second, okay.
So first from Christian, second from Rachel, I think, or Louisa.
We'll give it to Rachel Johnson.
Ready?
All right.
Rachel can take that.
There's been a motion. There's been a motion by Commissioner Alonso, seconded by Rachel Johnson, to continue the discussion of review board authorities and procedures into the next CFC meeting. All in favor, say aye.
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 Against?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. And so with that, we will move on to the last item for tonight, and that is just future business, where every meeting we pull up the draft agenda for next meeting. And Sam, if you could pull up the draft agenda. All right. So the draft agenda is essentially going to be, hopefully in the administrative agenda, we'll be able to present a scope of work. We're currently, the survey group is working to find a partner, and we're hoping that at that September 22nd meeting to be able to present that to the commission for approval. Next is the continuation of our discussion from today. And then that will be followed by the beginning of the conversation on auditor monitor. And depending on how long the first conversation goes, we might, well, we're definitely going to have to continue that second conversation, but we'll see how far we get into it. But it's good to have on the agenda just in case we have time to get into it. Any feedback or questions? We can't get into this. I just want to remind you, we can't get into the specifics of any one of these topics, but if you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And Mary?
I guess my only feedback is when it comes to the outreach efforts, and I'm being careful because I don't want to discuss, there's opportunities coming up pretty soon, and just wondering if the better venue is maybe to talk to the subcommittee about the language, what we're, some of the meetings that were on the calendar are coming up, and we can wait until the next month, but.
Would it be, oh, go ahead, Jordan.
I think that's something that Louisa and I at the marketing education group wanted to talk about, just the timeline adjustment and making sure that that all works. So we hear you, Mary, and we wanted to raise that. Yeah.
I
I
don't
will
know
talk
if
to you in between meetings, except for the limit on the number on the committee, I guess, but.
We have meetings scheduled. Well, we have a doodle poll with several meetings that are going to be scheduled for next week, and we met this week and last week, so we've been meeting. Yes.
I don't know if this needs to be an agenda item or if this is just a staff conversation, but considering what Anna had shared, that she's sitting in her car to attend this meeting, I'm wondering about access. So is it possible that the city can provide a hotspot for commissioners who are having difficulty accessing internet? So I don't know if that needs to be a discussion and something that we vote on, or if it can just be a staff conversation.
I'm happy to work with any of the commission, including the vice chair, to find a spot that would be conducive to her participation. I'm here at my office, so she can always sit over there, and we'll figure something out.
Okay. And then one last thing, the auditor monitor authorities and procedures seems like a really like a dense and important discussion to have. So I'm wondering if there's homework that we can, be assigned to review so that we come to the meeting informed.
Yeah, or send us a presentation in advance or something.
Yes, yeah, they're absolutely, I can do both of those things. I think that I will work on sending it.
You've done a great job facilitating this conversation and made this very easy and engaging. So perhaps we don't need that homework.
Yeah, my only hesitation was that you're gonna have homework for the next meeting. That's gonna include the kind of the consolidation of the notes I've taken and the samples of language of what that looks like. And so I can send you the other stuff with the understanding that if you have time for some additional light reading before the next meeting, that you can start that. But that we may not get to it. I think it's great that it's on the agenda. I just don't want to overwhelm anybody. I want to keep the discussion going and the decisions being made so we can finalize the review piece. But yeah, I want to keep you all very busy, and so I'll keep sending some stuff.
All right. Any other feedback?
It's not feedback, but like just acknowledgement. Thank you, Sam, for submitting the agendas in Spanish and English. That's been really helpful in the PowerPoints too. Like you have no idea, like we really appreciate it, and I've had positive feedback from the community to be able to access this information. So thank you.
And thank you, Vice Chair Zepeda, for leading that push for us to do that. We really appreciate that. And Rich, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just have, I hope this is okay to bring up. I'm curious, I am loving being on this commission, and that coexists with 9 o'clock is late for these meetings. And I'm wondering if anyone else is feeling that way, or should I just make it 5:30 to 9 every week that we do this, or should we try to talk about a time limit?
Go ahead, Mary.
I agree with what Rich is saying. At the same time, I don't know, short of adding more meetings in, I don't know what, or maybe having a meeting on a Saturday sometime instead of the nighttime. I don't know. But there is fatigue, definitely.
I want to echo that fatigue. I would say that we're in the heart of this right now. And so I'm hopeful that because we're getting into it and throwing out our brainstorms, that these are going to be longer meetings for the next couple, like 2 or 3. And then hopefully that they become a little bit more manageable. So that's just putting into perspective of the larger overall process that I think as we're putting things together, it might be longer meetings versus, when we're trying to get community outreach, it might be a shorter meeting. So just trying to see what that balance is before we make any major addition of extra meetings, et cetera. So.
And Chair, Vice Chair, if you could, hold us more accountable to the time limits. And I know I kind of go on, and I apologize for that. But it would help if you could tell me to shut the heck up, and let's move on to the next agenda item.
We'll be more diligent about time. We definitely will.
And thank you, Cami. I know it's way later for you.
It is my pleasure. I'm gonna need a nap tomorrow though, for sure. And I hear what you're saying, all of you, and doing this while fatigued isn't helpful in the long run either. So I will do what I can to try to really have some realistic goals for how much we can talk about in an evening and the decisions that can be made in an evening before everybody is a little wide-eyed or glazed over. So I will also take that into account. I'm glad you said something, Rick.
Thank you. I want to be very clear. I wasn't trying to call anybody out on anything. I just more wanted to, I noticed that we're all getting more and more tired as the night goes on. And I think like we want to give our best selves to this. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for elevating that point. Anything else? Sam, I doubt that there's anyone that wants to give public comment, but can you open up public comment and see if anyone?
There's no one in attendance, Mr. Chair.
All right, good news. Well, then we will close that item, and without further ado, we will adjourn the meeting at 9:16. Thank you all. I appreciate you all. Get some rest.
Good night, everyone.
Do we need a motion and a vote to adjourn the meeting?
No, Commissioner.
In order, or it doesn't matter? Okay.
No, Chair is able to adjourn it. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Be safe.